Hello there, welcome to the Saroy channel and welcome to my Omnibus series. I've got so many of these omnibuses that are going to come out so that you'll be able to listen to an hour's worth of stories, which I know you're going to love. You know, the thing is that telling stories is such a fine art, and it's something that was practiced hundreds of years ago when people didn't have the technology that we have today. And everyone would gather around the fire and listen to a wonderful story. And also, what is so wonderful about a story is that personally, I think it is the best way to go to sleep. Every night when I go to bed, I always listen to stories. And that's something that parents used to do with their children. It's something that they still do with their children. There's nothing better than a good story. And so I hope you're going to enjoy this series. And before we start, I just want to say, do subscribe to my channel because you don't want to miss out on anything. Because I'm in for the long haul and I want to make sure that you get the most stunning stories to go to bed with at night or to listen to when you want to be one of those people sitting beside the fire and listening. Don't forget to subscribe to my channel and let's get started. I hope you're going to enjoy the omnibus.
Dear Sarah and all your lovely listeners, my name is Clyde and I grew up in the early 80s in Charleston, West Virginia with my sister Ava and both of my parents, where we lived in a green leafy neighbourhood. As children, we often spent our weekends with my grandmother, who lived in a very regal-looking federal-style farmhouse on a substantial expanse of land that she let out to other farmers in the area for grazing purposes, so invariably you would always see sheep or cows grazing the verdant pastoral land. As kids, we relished every moment we spent on the farm. As for me personally, I found being out in nature to be the most edifying, uplifting experience of my life. It was like I felt I could breathe again. I felt unshackled and liberated, rather like a cat that had been released from the confines of its tiny drab cage. I would stretch out my legs, breathe in the rich oxygen-filled air, and alongside Ava, I would go exploring the countryside, running through fields of sagebrush, flowery meadows, and into vast areas of wood-green, where we would enter a shaded retreat, which on our farm consisted of ancient sequoia groves, redwoods, and a scattering of lodgepole pines. And when I say these trees were old, I assure you they had stood on our farm for hundreds of years, and seen through generations of the Sinclair family. The one thing I can tell you without a doubt is the older trees become, the more magnificent they are. So you can only imagine the regal prominence of these towering statuesque masterpieces that towered up into the heavens like heroical skyscrapers. Every time I explored the woodgrove, I was always drawn to touching their masterful trunks, for they beheld an invisible energy that grounded me and anchored me to my life, as I did have the propensity to be ever so slightly flighty. I cannot remember all the games my sister and I played in the countryside together, but believe me, they were many. The natural world always managed to hold our attention with a wondrous sense of awe. It could be a frog hopping around the edge of the stream, or a deer that crossed our path, stopping for a moment to regard us ever so curiously through the gentlest eyes, and then quickly scurrying off. One day as my sister and I were having breakfast on my grandmother's pretty patio that overlooked exquisite panoramic views of the resplendent emerald green countryside, all of a sudden we observed this mysterious dark silhouette seamlessly gliding towards the farmhouse and hesitantly stopping a few yards away from the porch. The critter stood very still, but let out a shrill whistle that rather reminded me of a bird call that I was rather acquainted with. Ava and I were astonished by what we were beholding. It was a giant-sized woman covered with long, flowing dark brown hair, with overlong arms and powerful legs. I would estimate she was easily 8 foot tall, 700 pounds, and her shoulders were approximately 3 foot wide. "Oh, that's Peppercorn," said my grandmother. "She's very reserved and shy, because you're here with me. She's not comfortable with strangers, which is why she's keeping a safe distance from us. I'm afraid she's not socially inclined." "Why has she got hair all over her body, Grandma?" I asked. "Oh, Peppercorn," my grandmother laughed. She's hairy because she's a wild woman. And how do you suppose she keeps warm without clothes? Nature has adorned her with a glorious coat." That made absolute sense to me, so I watched curiously as my mother approached Peppercorn with a basket of goodies that contained a large jar of honey, a bottle of milk, a loaf of baked bread, some cinnamon and raisin cookies, and a large bag of apples from the orchards. I could see that Peppercorn was carrying a wild turkey in her hands, and they exchanged goods, and the wild woman just glided away, looking very happy by the exchange. "It's called bartering," said my grandmother proudly, "which is something they do all the time in the Middle East when they exchange things. Look at the size of this thing," she said. "Peppercorn is quite the hunter." My grandmother was examining the turkey with a rather animated, thrilled look upon her face. "This is going to taste absolutely delicious for dinner," she said. "Anyone fancy helping me pluck the feathers out?" "I'll help you," I said eagerly. One night when we were staying on my grandmother's farm, we heard what I can only describe as a random gunshot, followed a little later by some high-pitched screams that sounded exactly like a woman being murdered. But we continued to sleep, seemingly unperturbed by the distractions of the dusky night, where the wind blew ominously through the trees, sometimes whistling, moaning and howling, often accompanied by the most anomalous, outlandish sounds of nature, which my grandmother always told us was probably just geese or coyotes. As for gunshots, they were not uncommon either in this part of the world, as sometimes people engaged in night hunting for coyotes or coons. However, I was startled when I heard a loud whacking sound at the front door in the middle of the night, along with a piercing whistle. Ava sat up in bed, looking startled. "What's going on?" she asked. "Don't look at me," I said, throwing on my gown and slippers and sliding down the banisters like a fireman on a pole, eager to see what on earth was going on. My grandmother was dressed in her nightgown, peered through the peephole of the door, and then unleashed the chain and opened it. We could see the large, hairy wild woman, looking frantic and discomposed by something, pointing towards the woods and imitating someone with a gun. Oh dear, sighed my grandmother. "Poachers again," she said, shaking her head furiously and reaching for her rifle. "Let's get rid of these hooligans," she exclaimed. In a trice she was walking side by side with the wild woman into the heart of the wood-green. She didn't realise that I was trailing behind her, but the wild woman most certainly knew, as she glanced back at me with her deep-set dark eyes that were alert to everything and missed nothing. I was eager to find out what had transpired, and to my astonishment we discovered a young woman lying on the ground, soaked in her own blood. She seemed to be mumbling. I was glad to see she was still alive. My grandmother indicated to Peppercorn to carry the strange woman, as we didn't have any time to lose. Peppercorn swiftly lifted the woman effortlessly into her arms, as if she was as light as a feather, gliding back to the house as speedily as a cheetah, with the grace of a ballerina and the dexterity of a mountain goat. My grandmother indicated for Peppercorn to place the girl on the kitchen table. Peppercorn stood and watched with us as my grandmother worked speedily on the girl, stopping the bleeding and removing the bullet from her leg. It was quite a masterful procedure, but my grandmother was quick and skillful with her hands, working speedily to retrieve the bullet and to stop the bleeding, while the poor woman whimpered and moaned in pain with a cloth stuffed in her mouth to help her bite instead of scream out. Finally, my grandmother poured alcohol over the open wound to sterilize it. "You'll live," she told the woman. "You're very lucky the bullet missed your main artery. You could have been a goner." "She saved my life," said the woman, pointing towards Peppercorn. "Delish was going to fire at me a second time, but she stopped him." Peppercorn, suddenly beginning to feel rather self-conscious by all the attention being lavished upon her, nodded at us ever so briefly and glided away out of the house towards the woods. I could see she was terribly shy, but I loved her demeanour, as she exuded a gentle, humble kind of energy, and I was secretly impressed that she had saved this young woman's life. Once the young woman had regained her strength, she told us exactly what had transpired, and my grandmother insisted she wanted to hear the story from the very beginning. "Don't leave anything out," she said. "I can't abide stories without a beginning, middle and end, because then they're not stories at all. You need to understand the beginning to make sense of the end. I interceded. My granny means you mustn't say the cat sat on the wall. The end, I said. You must explain why the cat was on the wall in the first place. Why did he get there? And where did he go in the end? What happened? Very well, said the woman. I think I get the general gist of what you're trying to say. My name is Fiona Fullington, and I'm from Charleston, Virginia. Me too, I piped, and so is Ava, my sister. Well, I work in the ladies' fashion department as a buyer at the department store. This is where I met Adesh Patel, who ran a local line of eclectic vintage designer clothes that we were buying for the store. It was my job to meet up with him regularly to discuss the individualistic clothing that was made in India with the Western-like influences to it. They had inspired a growing demand from all our customers for the collection. One day it was raining quite badly outside the Italian restaurant where Adesh and I were having coffee, discussing my next order for the department store, and Adesh was advising me on what exactly to order. Rather than getting completely soaked, he suggested we stay on at the restaurant for some pasta and salad until finally the rain subsided, and that's what we did. It seemed like a great idea at the time. My family is from Bombay in India. I was the only one really raised in America, although I go back to Bombay very regularly. We have a house here in Charleston, and a large apartment in Bombay, he told me. You could say we do a great deal of commuting for the business, as some of our materials can only be brought in India. That's why your clothes are so unique, and they're flying off the shelves like hotcakes. Everybody loves them. May I trouble you for some advice? Adesh interjected. I just wouldn't mind somebody else's opinion on this personal matter that concerns me greatly. Try me, I said, but I can't promise to be very knowledgeable. Well, my parents have planned an arranged marriage for me next month, with a girl from a highly esteemed, rather prominent high-class Indian family in Bangladesh. Brinda is her name, and she's a very beautiful young woman, whom I was fortunate enough to meet a couple of times before the big day. That's nice, I said. She sounds delightful. What's the problem? The trouble is, when I met her, I felt absolutely nothing. There was no spark, no connection, no electricity, if you know what I mean. No, I'm not sure I actually do. I don't think people who get embroiled in so-called arranged marriages are necessarily attracted to each other at first, I said. From what I gather, it's a growing relationship, rather like something you plant that eventually germinates into love. It needs to be watered and nurtured before it eventually blossoms, just like anything does. That's the trouble. I don't believe I could ever grow to love her. How do you know that? I piped. You barely know her, Adesh. Give the poor girl a fighting chance. It's like you're being judge, jury and prosecutor before even knowing what she's all about. I think you're being exceedingly unreasonable. I don't like her at all, said Adesh, and I know that sounds preposterous and unreasonable, but it's true. In fact, from the very second I met her, I disliked her intensely. And the moment she spoke, her squeaky voice was so annoying, it went through me like a resounding bell. I couldn't imagine waking up to that caterwauling, maddening voice every morning. It would drive me insane and do my head in. I did get a private investigator to find out more about her, and I was to discover that even her friends describe her as a spiteful bitch. Are you being serious? You got a private investigator to find out all about her character? Yes, I'm afraid I did. I had this gut-wrenching feeling that marrying her would be a grievous mistake on my part, and it seems I wasn't wrong. Whew, the feedback I'm getting on her character is less than favourable. She's described as like a candy bar, attractive and alluring on the outside, but the taste of the candy is as bitter as gall. Well, then don't marry her, Adesh. If you feel such revulsion towards her, wild dogs in hell wouldn't drag me down the aisle if I were wearing your shoes. You need to tell your parents exactly how you feel about her. I'm sure they'd understand. That's the problem. They're not going to be terribly happy with me, because there are hundreds of eligible wealthy bachelors in India dreaming to marry the very same girl. I mean, she comes from a very upmarket premier family, I might add. Well, let them, I said. Let them. Just let it not be you. Before long, Adesh and I were meeting up rather regularly, and as was expected, his parents were less than agreeable with Adesh's refusal to marry Brynda. He would phone me regularly, asking me to meet him to discuss the next instalment of family drama that was far more gripping, rousing and stirring than anything J.R. Ewing was doing in Dallas. I was riveted by the soap opera or situation comedy unfolding in Adesh's life. I sensed he was using every excuse in the book to see me, and I rather liked that. I'd get this flutter in my heart during our private little rendezvous. I'd never met anyone like Adesh before. He was Western thinking, but with American influences and exotic Indian edges to his personality that was very refreshing and endearing. If that wasn't alluring enough, he was handsome, charming and kind, and I guess we just connected on every single level. And I sensed he was feeling that spark like electricity between us. And then, "You fell in love," said my grandmother, finishing the sentence. "That's right. We fell in love, and Adesh asked me to marry him. I could hardly believe it. Well, he informed his family that he'd chosen a woman outside his culture to marry. And that went down like a lead balloon, I imagine," said my grandmother. Oh dear, she tutted to herself. "Exactly," said Fiona. "Well, Adesh and I made the wedding arrangements for next Saturday. Last Tuesday his father Delish approached me with a huge wad of bribery cash to persuade me not to marry his son. But obviously that was not going to work. "Please do not marry my son," said Delish. "He does not know what he wants. He thinks he's in love with you, but what does he know? At his age, he is a fool for marrying outside his culture and tradition. It is a disgrace. I do not want him to marry you. You are not the right woman." "I'm so sorry, Delish. I wish I could do what you want me to do, but I just love your son, and my decision is absolutely final. I'm not going to change my mind about marrying him. We love each other. We can't change the way we feel about each other. I'm so sorry." "You will regret the day that you ever laid eyes on Delish," said his father, glaring at me venomously, leaving the shop looking less than amused. Imagine my surprise when Adesh actually phoned me and told me that his parents had literally changed their minds about me and were so delighted to welcome me into their family. And somehow he'd managed to talk his parents around, and now they were very happy about our wedding. Earlier on in the day I went to their home in Charleston for lunch, and Adisha's parents were fussing around me and treating me like the Queen of Sheba. They were offering to do this and that for my wedding. Adisha and I were astonished by the complete turnaround in attitude on their part. I guess we were exceedingly naive and ignorant to have believed their flawless charade. Fiona continued, "There's a woman who lives in this neck of the woods. For all I know, it could be the next farm down or something. Well, she makes personalised jewellery, and she's actually making me a bracelet for my wedding day. And I happened to mention that I needed to pick up the jewellery after dinner. She told me that I couldn't come later than 8:30 this evening, and so that was what I was planning to do." "Oh, you mean Judith Thornbury? I know her very well," said my grandmother. "She's been making stunning jewellery all her life. She does make some incredibly stunning pieces." "That's right, Judith Thornbury, that's her name. Well, believe it or not, Delicia's father said it would be a privilege to take me to pick up the jewellery, and then to take me back home to Charleston. He said it was the least he could do, since he'd treated me so deplorably. It would seem we were having such a pleasant drive in the countryside, talking away happily together. Little did I realise that I was being led away like a lamb to the slaughter by this guileful, duplicitous man." "I changed my mind about you. You are good for my son. I see that now. I know the two of you will be very happy together." "Thanks, Delish. You don't know what hearing you say that means to me. I thought you were never going to accept me in your family. We thought we might have to elope and get married in Vegas," I piped. I could perceive the corner of Delicious' jaw clenching ever so tightly, and his dark eyes almost squinting at me like a bull terrier. Then he looked at me directly. "That would have been a very, very stupid thing to do. You know, families need to talk about their problems and reach resolutions so that things and issues can be resolved. Running into the sunset would never have been the answer to that situation. Look, we've sorted the problem out now, so there is nothing to worry about anymore. Delish pulled over to the side of the rugged dirt road in a remote area surrounded by forest, and then he parked his car. Is there something wrong? I asked. Oh, no, there is something very wrong with the car. I don't know, but did you not feel the way the car was not running as well as it normally does? I didn't notice anything. Delish then pulled his rifle out of the pocket and thrust it against my head. Get out of my car now, or I will blow your head right off. Do you hear me? I asked him, Delish, what's going on? What are you doing? You think I'm going to allow a Western woman to marry my Amish? That is never, ever going to happen, because I won't ever let it. Did I not warn you that this would not end well? But did you listen? Of course you did not. You do not understand my culture. We do not appreciate Western women interfering with our children. It's not right. Do you not understand? Now you are going to pay for your bad choices. I warned you about this, did I not? I knew in that instant that Amisha's father was going to murder me. There was no question of a doubt about that in my mind, and so I began to sprint towards the woods as fast as I could. I was filled with terror. I don't think I've ever been so afraid about anything in my entire life. He ran after me, firing random shots at me, and in a fleeting second I felt the searing heat shooting into my leg, and it began to ache and throb as I ran and ran. Suddenly I realized that my leg was very wet, and I noticed drops of blood everywhere. I'd been shot. I continued to run with a powerful adrenaline surge, but after a while I just collapsed onto the ground from the pain in my legs and the weakness I suddenly felt. I glanced up towards the grinning face that was staring down at me. Delish looked thrilled to see me incapacitated like this. Didn't take much to get you down. An Indian girl would have had a lot more spunk than you. I told you, you weren't right for my son. Goodbye now, because it's all over for you. I squeezed my eyes tight because his rifle was pointed directly at my head, and I knew I was powerless to escape. I was literally at this man's mercy, and he had none. I just hoped it would be quick, but nothing happened. I opened my eyes, and then I heard Delish screaming, and I looked up to see this wild, hairy woman throwing Delish into the air like he was a frisbee, tossing him up and down in her huge hands. And I promise you that humongous-sized creature made Delish look pathetically small and thin, like a Barbie doll, and he's not a small man by any manner of means. I think the creature was so angry with him because she was screaming at him, and her screams were so shrill they literally reverberated through my chest. I watched in awe as the creature carried Delish over her back like a sack of potatoes towards the stream, hurling him down the embankment, where I could hear him hit the water with a loud thud. Well, that was quite some story, Fiona, said my grandmother. I'm just so thankful you're alive. To cut a long story short, I was to learn that Delish did end up making a trip to the jeweller's house, as he had promised, but not quite in the way he would have envisaged, because it was his deceased body that arrived washed up on the edge of the stream on Judith Thornbury's property. I gather the coroner believed Delish had hit his head, been knocked unconscious, and accidentally drowned. It was ruled just as an accident. I'm very glad to inform you that Fiona did end up marrying the love of her life, Adish, and they're very happy together, with 2 children of their own. And they live in Canada now, and they are estranged from his immediate family. Fiona gave my grandmother the bracelet that she had designed by Judith as a gift. In her gratitude to Peppercorn for saving her skin, Fiona and Adish bought her the largest basket of gifts that you've ever seen in your life. Peppercorn was over the moon about the gifts, that she kept whooping and whooping with delight. It was hysterical to watch her. We could also hear other whooping sounds from the woods that night, so I imagine the family must have been equally as enthralled with all the presents, as much as she was. But we've never been privy to actually meeting any of them, because my grandmother told me once that they were more evasive than peppercorn, and that is saying something. Fiona bought Peppercorn a very strong leather thong, a necklace made for a giant, with a very attractive aquamarine stone at the end of it. I gather Amish went to visit a medium, who told him exactly what Peppercorn would like, and judging by her incredible reaction to the aquamarine stone, it was right on the money. The other gifts were literally food items, and there were so many of them, I can't even remember them all. But the ones that stick out were the peanut butter, the honey, the bags of nuts, the dried fruits, the fresh fruit, the grapes, the cookies, and the jerky. In the years that passed, I would sometimes see Peppercorn, and she was always wearing her aquamarine jewel so proudly around her neck. My grandmother sadly died about 20 years ago, and the farm was subsequently sold off. But as far as I know, Peppercorn's descendants may indeed be wandering around that valley, and now I know the critters are known to be Bigfoots. So there you are. That's my story. And I do wonder if one of them is actually wearing an aquamarine stone. Well, anyway, that was a fabulous story.
Dear Sarah, and all your lovely listeners, the Canadian weather forecaster had warned it was going to rain, and advised folk to have their umbrellas at the ready, but I hadn't paid the forecaster much heed or attention, as on way too many occasions to count, the forecaster got the weather so horribly wrong. I had happily skipped rather nonchalantly out of the front door, with a small bag flung very casually over my narrow shoulders. I may have been in my early 30s, but some people thought I was a teenager, which could be oddly frustrating, although many believed I was lucky to look so young for my age. They said that by the time I got to being 80 years old, I might look as if I was in my 60s. I'm not sure it works exactly like that, but here's hoping. I knew carrying the golfing umbrella would be a laborious task for one as slight as myself, so I left it behind, not believing for a single second that I would get caught up in the rain. Unfortunately, I didn't have a small umbrella in my possession to keep in my purse, as the last one I owned I had been forced to toss aside, as it got buckled up by a fierce oncoming wind when it had been pouring down with rain. So if it did rain today, well, I had no reinforcements at my disposal. But why should I worry about it? I wasn't going to get caught in the rain, I persuaded myself, for the 5,000th time. I contentedly sashayed down the road to the Peter Pan nursery school to pick up my little boy Harry, who was close to turning 5 years old and was too young for kindergarten at this stage, which was why he attended a nursery or preschool, if you like. The great thing about the Peter Pan nursery school is that they offered an after-nursery care service for working parents such as myself, so that the children could be picked up later in the afternoon, at the earliest convenience, while they were supervised by the nursery school teacher, so they were kept busy and entertained throughout the day. I enjoyed taking advantage of this service, and I also thoroughly enjoyed the walk every afternoon to pick up my son from nursery. It was a quintessential opportunity to take some light-hearted exercise and enjoy some fresh air in this prepossessing Toronto neighbourhood. Besides, I always liked the walk back home. It was fun to enjoy a chat with my little son. He would tell me what he'd got up to at nursery and what games he'd played with his little friends. I was fortunate to be a freelance photographer by profession, so I made absolutely certain that my schedule fitted around my son. So by the late afternoon he was all mine and had my undivided attention, and I could spend quality time with him. Harry had grown up without a father, as the man I dated for a mere 3 weeks, who had made me pregnant, refused to acknowledge that he could have possibly have become a father in such a short space of time. He didn't realize it takes one moment of intimacy to make a baby. I think the man was in complete denial, as I was telling him something he just did not want to hear. I was like the woman emerging from the woodwork like a termite, telling him he was a father. I think he wanted to put that idea to rest as quickly as he possibly could. I do remember he implied that I was clandestinely, cunningly setting him up to take responsibility for some other man's child. I decided that if this was his stinky attitude, it was just as well,
if he had no input in our lives, so I never contacted him again about the matter, although I sneakily suspect, underneath the layers of his abject denial, he probably did know that he might be my child's father. I wouldn't want Harry to grow up knowing his father refused to acknowledge him as his own progeny. No child needs an insouciant, detached father like that, as I believe that could only mess him up emotionally. The sky had been a delightful cup of blue that morning. The sun had beamed down on me, brushing its magnanimous warmth across my shoulders, so I was basking in its pleasing sensation. The houses showily paraded themselves rather immodestly down our street, like swanky catwalk models that knew that they looked good and weren't afraid to flaunt it either. They were in good shape. Most of them were in excellent condition, having been well maintained by their punctilious owners. Most of the front yards boasted proud displays of summer perennials, while the verdant lawns were meticulously mown, and hedges were fastidiously shaped and trimmed, some with a rather artistic prowess. I could see a couple of landscaping vans leaving our neighbourhood. Their services were in high demand on our street. I know this because I regularly made use of their services, although from time to time my brother Marcus would keep the yard looking great. The only house that stood out rather like a shark's fin in an ocean was Mr. Booth's house, that looked as if it hadn't received a lick of paint in many years. I did know that Mr. Booth was a couch potato, that never liked to lift a finger or to do anything that required very much effort. It was like he was the sloth of our neighbourhood, who would hang upside down and watch the world pass him by, if you know what I mean. He was the type that lightly would put off today what he could do tomorrow, and the trouble is, when you embrace such procrastination, things never ever get done. Regretfully, Mr. Booth's house was dilapidated and falling apart, and let's just say many a pretentious resident was not remotely happy about the eyesore on our street, with its overlong grass, its tangle of weeds in the front yard, and the untamed, burgeoning, tumble-down creepers that were artfully climbing the walls and creeping through any crack that would find its way into the house. There was an old 1940s rusted car parked in the front yard that looked like it was only good enough for scrap metal. Many believed Mr. Booth's eyesore, which they were sure would bring down the property values of their houses in the street, was an abomination. It was an ugly blotch on the landscape, like a nasty stain on your linen that you cannot wash out. The irony is that Mr. Booth was a retired lawyer, had plenty of money in his bank account to make the suitable changes to his home that would have been affordable for him. But his perennial laziness had invariably postponed any projects that might have transformed that pile of rubble he had the audacity to call his home into a pleasing property indeed, that could potentially be a great investment if he'd only look after the place. Some people surmised that Mr. Booth was penny pinching and didn't enjoy spending money at the best of times, and I do suspect that there might have been truth to these rumours. Either way, if the house continued its rapid descent into decline and decay like a rotting tooth in the gums, Mr. Booth might not be able to keep his house for very much longer. I myself lived in an old Victorian that was divided into two properties. One part of the house was mine. The other part belonged to my neighbours, a young couple called the Fenters, who were hard-working, from the local university, and looked very studious, always wore sensible clothes and glasses, and would leave their house on the back of their bicycles every morning, determined to do their bit to save the environment. I understood they were both strict vegans, refused to wear leather shoes, and only used cleaning products that were environmentally friendly and stripped of all nasty chemicals to clean their home. I do recall once wearing a fake fur jacket on a rather unfriendly freezing cold winter's morning that looked astonishingly real. By all accounts, the fearsome, rather ferocious look that Mrs. Fenter directed at me that morning could quite literally have exterminated an entire field of cows in a single second, without needing a slaughtering house to turn them into beef. She was trying to hold back her disquieted expression from me with very little success. For some reason I felt like that kid that had been caught with my hand in the candy jar. I felt I owed her an explanation, as if I had to almost apologize for what I was wearing, to redeem myself in her eyes, and reassure her I didn't go around murdering animals for their pelts, which is exactly how Mrs. Fenter would have seen it. "You're looking at my coat," I said with a light chuckle. "This old thing, it's just a fake. I wouldn't wear a real fur coat for a second." Mrs. Fenter had walked over to me. She examined my coat thoroughly, running her fingers down the synthetic fibre. "It's a very good fake, I have to admit," she said, looking suspiciously at my coat. And then she sighed with abject relief. "I'm sorry if I glared at you earlier, but women who wear animal pelts, well, I'd personally like to skin them alive myself. They should be ashamed of themselves. See how they like it. Nothing upsets me more than women who buy luxurious fur coats for the purposes of fashion, that they have stolen off the back of some of our most beautiful wild animals that should be wearing those coats themselves. Do these self-centered, vainglorious people even stop to consider the poor animal in question that died on their accounts? They gave up their life to support the extreme vanity of someone who buys that coat." She shook her head furiously. "I don't think they care, do they? All they care about is how great they look. Well, if you can buy fake furs as good as the one you're wearing, there is no need for anybody to wear the real thing, is there?" "My thoughts exactly, Mrs. Fenter. If you can get a good fake fur, why do you need a real one?" "Very well put, my dear, and I'm very glad to hear you say it. I'd better be going." Let's just say we had a vast selection of different characters living down our street that were as varied as the tropical birds you find in the South American rainforest. I casually scooted down the street, hearing the occasional dog bark, and sneakily looking into people's yards to admire their perennial flower beds. When I reached Mr. Booth's rather offensive-looking home, I took one look at the grubby exterior of the crumbling ruin, and practically squirmed as I saw a pile of bin liners had popped open outside his front door. Didn't he even have the foresight to take him to the bin? Was he really that lazy? There was a large, mangy-looking dog scavenging in the bags, spreading the contents all over the place, littering Mr. Booth's entire front yard, so that I could smell rotting vegetables everywhere. The rancid smell was so disgusting, I very nearly gagged. I had never seen the mysterious dog before, but I immediately guessed it had to be a stray. But anybody could see it was ravenously hungry, doing its damnedest to survive. It looked to be a mix of a retriever and husky, but when it saw me, it looked at me through frightened dark eyes, as if it had been abused by a human before, and had no trust for the human species. It scooted away hurriedly. Poor thing, I thought. It was so dreadfully emaciated, with bones that were sticking out of its rib cage like sharp dagger-like needles that were so obtrusively prominent it was actually scary to see. In truth, the dog looked as if it should not have been even alive. That was how painfully thin he was. I'd been thinking of getting little Harry a dog. He'd asked for one for long enough, and a dog like that would be a lovely companion to bring into our home. And when people popped over to the house to have their photographs professionally done by me, it would be good to have a friendly dog around to welcome them. A dog with a wagging tail and a happy bark. That dog would be absolutely perfect for us, and I could see it desperately needed a home and a family's love. Would I get a chance to find it again? The poor thing was so frightened. I glanced up and down the street to look for the dog, but I saw no sign of it, or anyone else for that matter. As was expected, Eleanor Madison's white net curtains began to flinch as I walked past. I suspected she was having a jolly good look at me. Her house was prominently situated on the edge of the street. I guess she got a bird's-eye view of everything and everyone that walked past. She probably liked it that way. I wasn't remotely surprised. Everyone knew her to be the quintessential snoop, that liked putting her nose into people's business. She had strong opinions about everything. If there was something worth knowing, you can bet your bottom dollar Mrs. Madison knew all about it. People like her were useful, as 20 years ago we didn't exactly have much CCTV footage, so she was the perfect neighborhood watch. Back in the day, she would impress you with the details she retained. It was thanks to her steely powers of observation that she was able to tell Mr. Booth who in the neighbourhood had been sending him nasty notes in the post, telling him he was not welcome here and needed to get away from the neighbourhood. It was on this unassuming, predictable weekday in our neighbourhood that mainly consisted of young families or career-orientated people who spent the lion's share of their day at work and only arrived home at about 5 or 6 o'clock in an evening. But there was always a lot of activity in the street on a Saturday, with people walking their dogs, riding bicycles, tending dutifully to their front yards. I couldn't help thinking that if anyone was around who had heard the formidable weather forecast predicting heavy showers, they'd probably saliently buried themselves into their homes for the next few hours. Maybe they were cooking something, or possibly reading a book. To be fair, I had just seen old Mr. Curtis Barry walking his retired greyhound down the street. The trouble with Mr. Barry was that the man was so deaf and hard of hearing that whenever you talked to him, he'd put his hand on his ear and shout back, "What was that you said? What were you saying, love? Sorry, I didn't hear you." I know he wore a hearing aid, but I'm not sure if he ever put the damn thing on. You'd have to repeat yourself over and over again, and then he'd go off into a tangent onto a completely different topic of conversation, as he had not heard you in the very first place. So if you were talking about the weather being good, for example, he might think you were talking about his wife being a good cook, and before you knew it, you had been standing there for a couple of hours with him on the street corner, discussing the various dishes his wife made. "Oh, you're talking about my Angie, are you not? Yes, she's an excellent cook, is my Angie. One of the reasons I actually married the woman. My father used to tell me, if you can find a good woman who can cook, you're set up for life, my son. He wasn't wrong about that, you know. Marrying Angie is the very best thing that I ever did. Never regretted it for a single moment. And on top of it all, that woman has got a good heart. Do you know what her secret is to making the quintessential best meatloaf you have ever tasted?" And before I knew it, I'd be given a step-by-step recipe by the well-meaning man. I raised my hand and waved at him before he had a chance to stop and casually meander to my side of the road. I could see his brown bird-like eyes looking eager, as if he was hopefully anticipating a good old chinwag with me. The last thing I needed was to be held up in the traffic congestion of one of his tediously boring conversations yet again, or be given another recipe for meatloaf. Besides, I needed to get to the Peter Pan nursery as soon as I could. I had arranged to have coffee with Harry's nursery school teacher, Mrs. Hancock, after the nursery closed for the day. The Peter Pan nursery school was hemmed in by this bright balustrade fencing, painted in pale pinks, pale blues, greens, yellows and oranges. There were cute little ducks painted all over the walls, and a picture of Peter Pan himself at the front entrance of the school. In the backyard of the nursery school you could see jungle gyms, swings, sand pits and paddling pools. There was a printed sign dangling from the front violet-coloured gate that read, "Peter Pan Nursery School, Welcome." I opened the squeaky gate and sashayed down the stone path, glancing very briefly at my watch. I was 10 minutes early, but as my mother always used to say, "The early bird catches the worm," and I'd always abided by that principle. On seeing me once I entered the classroom, Mrs. Hancock, who was bent over a child's painting, looked up at me and came rushing over to me, wearing her long tweed pencil skirt and white blouse. She had a Mary Poppins look about her, and her bright-spirited warm eyes were always both attentive and friendly. "Hello there, Miss Mackintosh. How are you?" "I'm fine," I said. "We're about to clear up after our painting, aren't we, kids?" she said, clapping her hands together. She was looking after 10 children that afternoon. The vast majority of them had obviously returned home after lunch. The remaining children, who had working parents and were being picked up later, were still with her. "I want you all to wash up your paint brushes and your trays and the glass bottles and put them back neatly. Do you understand?" "Yes, Miss Hancock," the kids chorused together. I watched them industriously lining up at a large sink to wash away the excess of their paint. Mrs. Hancock smiled at me, a warm, genuine, kind smile that met her bright eyes. Your Harry has done a delightful picture today, which he tells me he painted especially for you, Miss Mackintosh. Come and take a look at it. He's been inspiring all the children today with his bright, ingenious ideas. The paintings today are a tad on the unusual side, featuring some rather idiosyncratic additions thanks to your son. But I'm sure little Harry will put you well into the picture about that. I raised a quizzical brow. Is that right? Sounds interesting. I'm looking forward to seeing this picture. Well, said Mrs. Hancock, pointing to my son, Harry's over there in the far corner. He's sharing a table with little Jack over there. Go and take a look at his lovely painting. I'll be with you shortly. The children all looked up at me curiously as I walked around their childlike plastic tables and tiny chairs that ranged from yellow to pink and blue. I curiously examined their pictures. The kids had painted with an enthusiastic gusto. The one thing about little children that I noticed after becoming a mother myself is they're not remotely inhibited about what they paint. They go for it so naturally, not being clouded by reticence, uncertainty, or self-doubt. If they're asked to draw a tiger, they won't consider whether they know how to paint one or not. They'll just take the plunge, without recruiting the reservation we adults tend to do. As when we get older, it's easy for us to shrink away and just say, I can't possibly do it. Everyone wanted me to look at their pictures. I naturally oohed and ahed the way you do over children's expressive artwork, as if they were all aspiring Picassos. Or to be fair, some of the pictures were really, really good. I was naturally biased as far as Harry was concerned, as I believed his painting was the best, but I would say that because I'm his mother. Look what I've done, Mummy, he said to me proudly, his eyes dancing with merriment. He slipped his tiny little hand in mine, that was surprisingly cold, and led me over to the picture he had painted, that was lying flat against the table. The boy called Jack, who was sharing a table with him, was cleaning up after himself fastidiously, and gave me a warm, indulgent smile. Look, Mummy, said Harry excitedly. This is the picture I painted. This is you standing outside our house, and this is me. The Fenters live over there. I bent down to examine Harry's painting more closely. What is that big thing flying in the air? I asked him, pointing to this big brown bulky thing, taking up a huge portion of the sky. It was unusual for Harry to draw anything like this, and I couldn't for the life of me work out what it was. It's a big bird! And do you see those round splodges, Mummy, falling out of the sky? That's the bird's poop. It's falling onto the roof of our home. I made sure there was lots and lots of it. I raised a brow. Bird poop? Why would you paint bird poop? I asked. I don't understand. 'Cause the bird is flying over our house. It's spraying our roof with lots and lots of poop, so we can be very lucky. Bird poop is lucky. You told me that, remember, when the bird pooped over the windscreen, you said it was very lucky. Well, it is supposed to be lucky, I admitted. I painted some bird poop as well, Miss Mackintosh, said Jack, who was sharing a table with Harry. Everybody in the class painted bird poop in their paintings 'cause it's lucky. Harry told us it's lucky. Louise put splodges all over her picture as well, didn't she, Harry? My son nodded in agreement. Louise said she wanted to be very lucky, that's why. I examined Jack's painting. Where is the bird poop? I asked. I don't see it anywhere. Jack pointed to a brown puddle on top of the roof of a tiny little house he'd painted in his picture. This is it, he said proudly. A bird sat on the roof, you see, and left behind a poop. So it's a lucky house. The bird marked it, you see. That's very nice, Jack, I said. Jack looked very pleased with himself. Over there in the far corner, Mrs. Mackintosh, is a lady beetle. Can you see it? I squinted, narrowing my eyes, as little Jack pointed to a lady beetle in the picture that initially I thought was a dog wearing a red coat with black spots, as the lady beetle was so large in proportion to the house, rather like a cat or a dog. That's a very big ladybug, isn't it, Jack? I said. That's because I want my picture to be very, very lucky, Miss McIntosh, he said excitedly. Lady birds are lucky. I'm going to also paint a 4-leaf clover, but I'm going to make it into a tree in the yard, because 4-leaf clover is very lucky. That sounds lovely, Jack, I said encouragingly, smiling at the child's enthusiasm, and the paint he'd managed to spray over his cute little heart-shaped face. The children in the nursery school were well behaved for children so young, and were all terribly enthusiastic about the lucky additions they had added to their paintings, in the form of bird poop, 4-leaf clovers, and lady beetles. I could not help but be rather amused that a little comment from my son about bird poop being lucky had meant the children had all added lucky symbols to their paintings. I was glad to send Jack to a nursery school like this, with such an interactive teacher like Mrs. Hancock, who genuinely adored the children in her charge, and even working long, tedious hours did not appear to tire her in the least. Harry rarely enjoyed it at nursery, making papier-mâché pigs out of balloons, finger-painting, colouring in, drawing, and playing all kinds of games with Lego blocks and school tricycles. He loved it all. I noticed that his interaction with the other kids had made him so much more confident these days. The first day I brought little Harry to the Peter Pan nursery school. He had been cowering behind my legs, clinging tightly to my dress, peeking behind me at the teacher, with fear edged in his eyes, as if he felt he was like a chicken being thrown into a den of wolves. He had burst into tears, refusing to leave me, but I left him there, alone at the nursery, feeling like a prize cad to abandon him like that. But it couldn't be helped. I had work to do. I had a living to make. But the very next day he was champing at the bit to get back to nursery, as kids are quick to adapt to a new environment, and in one day he claimed to have made tons of friends, and it would seem that he certainly had. The teacher, Mrs. Hancock, managed to help the children clear up all their paint, wash their brushes thoroughly, and clean up after themselves, so that they no longer had even a drop of paint left on them. I waited for the children to go, to get ferried away by their parents. Many arrived in dribs and drabs, while greetings were exchanged between us, as I knew the mothers and their children personally, from a plethora of birthday parties I had attended over the last year or so. Mrs. Hancock had invited me to have coffee with her. She wanted to have a little chat with me about Harry's progress. This was something she did with the parents from time to time, to help them keep abreast of things regarding their children. I really appreciated the one-on-one chats that I had with Mrs. Hancock, that she had with all the other parents. She was that kind of skillful teacher who was so passionate about her job and wanted the very best for all her pupils, so that once they went to kindergarten and beyond, they were in a good place emotionally, physically and mentally. On this occasion, all Mrs. Hancock could do was sing Harry's praises, and I know she meant every word of what she said. "He's a special little boy, Miss McIntosh, but I'm sure you know that only too well. Did you notice his influence over every kid in class this afternoon? They were all painting bird poop on their pictures. That was your son's influence. He was telling everybody about lucky symbols. So everybody wanted to paint ladybugs, 4-leaf clovers, horseshoes, and bird poop." "But you forgot one thing," I said with a teasing smile. "I did?" said Mrs. Hancock. "What is that, then?" "The black cat, of course. Everybody knows that when a black cat crosses your path, it's very good luck." Mrs. Hancock chuckled. "Why didn't I think about that one? No prizes for guessing what the children will be painting tomorrow afternoon. Black cats wearing 4-leaf clover collars around their necks," she joked. "Sounds absolutely lovely," I said. "I've got so many of Harry's paintings all over my refrigerator. There isn't enough room to accommodate them all. I have to change them every week. He adores painting classes with you. And frankly, I'm amazed how expressive his paintings are for one so young." "Your son is terribly, terribly talented, Mrs. McIntosh. Sorry, Miss McIntosh. At just 5 years old, your son is a powerful influencer, as I was saying. When I think of the first day when he arrived here at the Peter Pan nursery, how demure he was back then. And look at him now. The contrast is amazing. That little cheerful boy has become the life and soul of the party. Oh, it is incredible. He has really blossomed at nursery, come out of his little shell. So he's in effect morphed from a frightened little crab into a brightly coloured angelfish. A metamorphosis of note, shall we say? She chuckled. She continued, At first I thought he would be the quietest, most bashful, restrained, reticent kid in my class. But that didn't last terribly long, did it? I would go so far as to say he's one of the most spirited kids here at the nursery. Harry's a very special boy, Miss Mackintosh. You should be terribly proud of him. He knows his own mind. He's assertive. He's ambitiously attempting to do new things all the time, and will rise to every single challenge that presents itself. As for your son's paintings, they are particularly good, Miss Mackintosh, but I'm sure you've noticed that. So vibrant and bright, so expressive. He's a very advanced child for his age, you know, particularly bright and upbeat about everything. He doesn't discourage very easily. Nothing gets him down. And he's got a good heart on him, you know. The other day, for example, little Anna Thor fell over when she slipped over some juice that someone had spilt on the classroom floor. She grazed her knee and began to howl out in pain. It gave me the most dreadful shock. Anna Thor has got a mouth on her that is so loud it would make a foghorn seem mute. Truly, I thought something devastating had happened, that one of the kids was seriously injured. But thankfully it was a minor abrasion on her knee. Oh dear, I said empathetically. The day in the life of a nursery school teacher, I suspect. There's drama all around, is there not? Mrs. Hancock laughed. I do sometimes wonder why I signed up for it all. But I wouldn't have it any other way, you know, Miss Mackintosh. My life would be so dull without the children in it. I know what you mean, I said. When Harry came along, he brightened my life so much. I've never been the same since. Kids do that to you, don't they? They bring you back to life. Sorry, what were you saying about little Anna Thor? Mrs. Hancock chuckled again. Well, when Anna fell, little Harry gallantly ran over to her at once. He's so chivalrous for one so young. When he grows up, he's going to be a perfect gentleman, breaking hearts all over the place, I suspect. He was the first one to help her up on her feet again, and to stop her from crying. I heard him say, Don't worry, Anna, your knee may hurt now, but I promise you the hurt will go away soon. It always goes away. Little Anna had been sobbing her heart out like kids do when they hurt themselves, but Harry's kind words made the tears dry up at once. As I was saying, Miss Mackintosh, you've got a good one there. The kids in my nursery, many of them are reflections on how well they've been raised by their parents. Most of the children have two parents raising their children, Miss Mackintosh. So I commend you greatly for doing such a sterling job, being a single parent. It can't be easy for you raising little Harry all on your own, while making an income. It's highly commendable of you. I'm not sure I could do it myself, if the boot was on the other foot. I may be a married woman, Miss Mackintosh, but it may surprise you to know that I don't have children of my own, because I think of my kids as being here at the nursery school. I would be too exhausted to raise my own. I can imagine, Miss Hancock, with screaming kids all day. The last thing you need is to go home to screaming kids at night. I appreciate all the kind things you're saying about Harry, Mrs. Hancock. He's a good boy, and I am terribly proud of him. You're right. It hasn't been easy raising him single-handedly, I said, taking a sip of my steaming coffee. But then again, the best things in life are never easy, are they? They challenge you, and I think we all enjoy challenges, even though we might not be willing to admit that to ourselves. That's an excellent way to put it, Miss Mackintosh. Do you mind dreadfully if I ask you where Harry's father is? Is he in the picture or not? You don't have to tell me anything, of course. Tell me to mind my own business if you like. I do appreciate that people's lives are terribly private, and I, for one, do not want to intrude. but knowing more about my pupils helps me to understand them better, if you know what I mean." I shrugged my shoulders nonchalantly. "I've got nothing to hide. I'm not embarrassed to discuss my private life with you, Mrs. Hancock. You can ask me anything you like. When it comes to Harry's father, there's not terribly much to say about the matter. I'm not in contact with him anymore. Let's just say he was someone I dated for about 3 weeks, and the relationship went completely pear-shaped, rather quickly, I hasten to say. And when I discovered I was pregnant, and we had nothing in common, well, it was too late, wasn't it? I contacted him weeks later, telling him he'd made me pregnant, but he said that I was lying to him, and was after his money. And you know what I thought, Mrs. Hancock? Well, if that's your stinky attitude, I don't want you involved in my son's life anyway. Suffice to say, I've never heard from him since, nor do I actually want to. That ship has long since sailed, and I have no regrets about that at all." "Well, I'm sorry to hear that, Miss Mackintosh. That can't be easy for you. But I do agree with your decision on that matter. I mean, with his deadbeat attitude, why would you want him involved with Harry? He's better off without him, isn't he? I always encourage single mothers like yourself to bring a man into the fold, be it an uncle or a grandfather, to help the young boy in question receive that quintessential male bonding."
"Well, Harry does have my brother, his Uncle Marcus. The two of them get on like a house on fire, and Marcus is a powerful role model in his life."
"Well, that's very great to hear. How often does he see this Marcus, your son, I mean?"
"About 3 times a week," I said. "Marcus is not married, you see. He lives with me but works hard in building construction. He only gets home sometimes late in the evening, after spending time with friends, and after Harry has long since retired to bed. But he's a big part of little Harry's life. Definitely a good role model to him, even if he's out a lot and goes away from time to time."
"That is very good news to hear, Miss Mackintosh. It certainly allays my concerns. I'm glad to have spoken to you today. It has been a great pleasure. I like to know as much as I can about the pupils in my charge. As I was saying, you've got a special one with little Harry, Miss Mackintosh. He's my favourite child here at the Peter Pan Nursery School, and I don't say that lightly. It's not something I would say to everybody. But your son is turning out to be a very special little boy. I always say to parents that it's very important how they raise their children, because it influences the adults they will one day become. Not many people know that, Miss Mackintosh. Do you know they say that our personality develops between the ages of 3 and 6, which is why those are such impressionable years. When children are abused at that young age, sometimes they never fully recover from those traumatic experiences that can invariably scar them for life and affect their overall mental well-being as they get older. At this age, it's important to teach them compassion and to encourage our kids to share."
"I didn't know that," I said, "but come to think of it, it makes an awful lot of sense." I hasten to say, I probably did leave the Peter Pan Nursery School with a rather expanded ego. Everybody loves to hear teachers singing their own children's praises, and I was no exception to that rule. I'm sure Mrs. Hancock told everybody their children were wonderful, but I wanted to believe that she thought Harry was extra special, and she had said almost as much. Forgive me if I wanted to bask in the glory of her compliments like a walrus on a sandy beach, sinking back to enjoy the sunshine on his back. But I couldn't help myself. I was doing just that. I took Harry's little hand in mine, and we walked back from the nursery school together, with a skip in our steps. I took one glance up at the sky and groaned. The sky seemed to have forgotten it was supposed to be summer. Dark clouds loomed thunderously across the blue expanse, almost as if they were conspiring against me. It looked more like early evening than late afternoon, as everything became so much darker. I could hear a low grumble as thunder rolled in the distance, and I inwardly winced as I could sense that rain was about to come. I could feel its promise in the air, and then I felt a few little drops squirt out of the sky. Would I make it home in time, I wondered, without getting soaking wet?
Could the sky just hold back its tears for a moment longer? "Mummy, I think it's going to pour with rain," said Harry, looking up at the sky and expressing my very worst fears. Don't get me wrong, I enjoy rain, but being stuck in the midst of it is a different story altogether. "That's what we need to do. Walk back home as fast as we can. Do you think you can increase your pace?" I asked Harry encouragingly. "I think I can walk a bit faster, Mummy. Mummy, I feel a couple of drops on my cheeks. It's definitely raining now," said Harry, staring up at the sky. He opened up his mouth, holding back his neck, to catch a few raindrops on his tongue. I was now silently cursing myself for my insouciance. I had snorted indignantly at the weather forecaster's rather beleaguered prognosis for the rest of the afternoon, taking a turn for the worst. I hadn't believed a word of it. The sunshine had been so bright and clear, and it had given me the false, misleading impression that the forecaster was wrong yet again. I knew now, with a few droplets running down my skin, that more rainfall was imminent. The clouds looked as if they were about to burst and unload their sorrowful woes upon us, and I knew that this onslaught of rain would likely be heavy. It was so typical of me to get caught in the rain like this, but there was little I could do to redeem myself, apart from hurry up and get back home as quickly as possible. But little Harry seemed to be caught up in the moment, as if being out in the rain like this was a great big adventure for him, and his childlike inquisitiveness appeared to want to embrace it all. Indeed, Harry's 5-year-old feet appeared to be obstinately dragging along, as if he didn't want to leave the street. He did try to increase his pace, to be fair to him, but would slow down as he stared up at a roof that we passed in the neighbourhood, where a large volume of pigeons began to fly away with a mighty flap of wings, as if they'd been chased off by a large cat. Harry chuckled to himself, pointing up at the pigeons. "They don't want to get wet, do they, Mummy? That's why they're flying away to the trees." "Well, the birds are clever, aren't they? We don't want to get wet either, so we need to walk a little faster, don't we, Harry?" Harry was carrying his painting proudly in his hand. He nodded at me, giving me a big smile. He held my hand tightly in his, and we walked together down the pavement, and then the heavens unapologetically opened. The rain came pelting down in sheets. I began to panic, quickly stepping up my pace and encouraging Harry to do the same, but he wasn't exactly doing very well. "Harry, we need to walk a little bit faster. Do you think you can do it? A little bit faster?" Harry nodded. There was nowhere we could go to shelter to get out of the rain. Even a bus shelter would have been a reassuring welcome for us, but sadly, no such luck. We needed to get home as fast as we possibly could. I was sure by the time we got indoors, the both of us would be so drenched we would be like 2 drowned rats, having to tear off our clothes to get into warmer garments, leaving puddles of water all over the place. I'd been caught up in the rain before, and ended up with a summer cold days later. I didn't want little Harry to come down with something like that. I was privately cursing myself for not being vigilant enough. Mrs. Hancock had described me as being a great mother. But would a great mother allow her own son to get soaking wet like this? I should have known better. I should have brought along that golfing umbrella with me. It was too late to indulge in the pleasure of hindsight. Me and Harry were now caught in the deluge, and the rain came down furiously fast and hard. I was now flicking back my soaking wet hair from my face, while trails of mascara poured down my cheeks and began to sting my eyes. I was squinting in the rain through narrow slits. My eyes burned with the irritant of my mascara. We stepped up speed, trailing down a slippery pavement, my chin buried in the collar of my dress. It would seem passing cars sent spray over our shoes, their headlights glinting through the darkening day. It really did feel like early evening. Harry was jumping up and down in the puddles of rain, as if it was all a great big exciting game. He stared up at me, with wet eyelashes that formed dark clumps around his eyes. "This is so fun, Mummy! I really love the rain," he said, giggling at the cascades of droplets that clung to his face. My son was now soaked to the skin, and did not appear to mind in the least. From the moment my little Harry got up in the morning, to the very moment he laid down his sweet head on the feather-down pillow for a long night's sleep, he was always a rambunctious ball of energy, and I would never have wanted it any other way. His enthusiasm and zestfulness for life was absolutely infectious, and even now, as it bucketed down with rain, he made the whole experience a lot more bearable. He giggled and laughed, kicking the puddles of raindrops that trespassed across our path. "Be careful of your pitcher," I warned him. "Try not to get it wet, Harry." But I could see it looked like it was completely saturated with water. It was folding up in my son's hands, like a curl of chocolate. I could see that the pitcher was clearly ruined. I scrambled awkwardly down the pavement, holding Harry's hand tightly in mine, and moving as quickly as my son's 5-year-old legs would actually allow. We soon passed Curtis Barry's house, and it did cross my mind for a brief second to impose on their hospitality, while the heavy raindrops became more subdued. Thankfully for a moment the rain appeared to ease, although a spirited, rather gusty wind whipped up against our faces. The road had become ominously silent, for we saw no more cars skirting down our street and unapologetically spraying us with yet more water, which in itself was a relief. "Nearly home," I told little Harry encouragingly. But he didn't seem to be bothered about the rain at all, but enjoying it all, as if it was an exciting adventure. But that was the way little Harry viewed the world. Everything was exciting in his callow, naive, wistful eyes. The thought of home only houses away was a seductive, welcome allure for me, and if I had my way, I'd have run home like the wind, but Harry was too heavy for me to carry. The street was so quiet and peaceful at this moment. A gust of wind stole my son's painting from his grasp with a forceful tear, and with a life of its own, like a balloon on the wind, it blew straight into the middle of the tarmac road. In the same breath, my son let go of my hand and ran into the middle of the road to grab his painting. I shouted, "Stop! Come back, Harry! Forget the painting, it's ruined anyway! Leave it, will you?" In that moment I heard the car, before I actually saw it, as its engine roared down the street, its tires moving furiously fast down the tarmac. I'm about to dash after Harry to grab him back to safety, when the unthinkable happens, as the big hulk of metal belonging to an SUV comes from nowhere at a speed not acceptable for a day like this, when people should drive with due care and caution. There was an ear-piercing shrill squeal of tires, a dull thud of brakes, the fragile, delicate sound of a 5-year-old body hitting the windscreen as it finally slammed violently onto the tarmac with such a forceful ferocity you'd be hard-pressed to believe that anyone could survive such a gut-clenching impact. My heart thundered against my rib cage. My body took flight like a bird on the wind. I dashed towards my son, unable to feel my legs beneath me. I was believing that I was caught up in a nightmare that just could not be real. A deep guttural wail emerged from inside of me, a sound I've never heard before or since, that I had no idea I was capable of making. I cried out in terror as my primal instinct to protect my son seized me. "No! No! No!" I screamed as I ran towards him. His painting was flying across the road, but my boy was lying in a mangled, crumpled heap before me, his body motionless, his vacant eyes staring up into the blue sky, as if searching for a rainbow. A pool of crimson blood spread out onto the road beneath his head. "No!" I screamed. "No!" I looked up at the blurred windscreen of the driver. The wipers were moving furiously fast, sending arches of water across the glass, and I caught a brief glimpse of her. It was a woman. Her eyes met mine, and I could see fear in their depths, as she quickly backed away, swiveling her car, turning it around into the road rather clumsily, and with a mighty jerk she speeded off into the distance until I was left all alone on that tarmac road. I'm crouching beside my son, tears spilling down my cheeks. I'm searching frantically for a pulse that I know I will never find. Please God, may there be a sign of life. Don't let him die! I'm inwardly crying, "Please, God, no!" But it's all useless. A blurry figure runs towards me across the road. I recognise the voice as that of my near-deaf neighbour, Curtis Barry. "My God, what's happened here?" he cried out. He was silent for a brief moment. He stares down at the deceased figure of my son in bewilderment, and then scrambles over to my side to scoop me up into his arms lovingly, offering me kind words of comfort and encouragement that he struggled to find. "It's going to be all right. I promise you it's going to be all right." But when is a hit and run ever going to be all right? I'll never be getting my son back, never. I collapse into Curtis's arms and cry tears that rival the raindrops that are thundering down to the earth. One thing for certain is my life will never ever be the same again. 2 months later, I barely recognise the horrifying gaunt shadow that stares back at me in the mirror. Someone gave me a compliment the other day for looking like a stick-thin figure with anorexic legs like matchsticks. "Oh, you are so lucky to be so terribly thin," I was told. "What I would give to be like you." I winced when she said this to me, for I'd given far too much, and no one would give up this much to be thin. No one in the entire world. Indeed, I'd lost so much weight. My clothes were hanging off me limply like rags. My face was so pale and white, and yes, my under eyes were surrounded with dark half-moons. My brother Marcus had been encouraging me to eat, but I had no interest in food whatsoever, or anything else for that matter, as I guess in my darkest night of the soul, my desire to live had long since been expunged. A light had gone out for me, and all I could think was the relief I would feel to leave behind this world and reunite with my son again. "Sis, you look dreadful," he kept saying to me. "Eat something, for God's sake, just something, before you fade away before my very eyes." I have lied back lamenting on the bunched-up pillows of my solitary king-size bed, feeling desperately alone, forsaken and terribly lost, shedding ubiquitous tears that seemed to have known no end. Indeed, I had cried so much, I simply had no tears left to cry. I had become like a dried-up old riverbed, for nothing wanted to come out of me any more. It was almost as if my body was rebelling against me, refusing to accommodate my grief. How did I go on living in such grievous despair, when my son Harry was no more? I would never see his cute little face puckering up into a wide, cheeky grin, nor would he present me with another one of his artworks again, that me and Mrs. Hancock had appreciated so much. My brother Marcus had been desperately kind to me under the circumstances, as dealing with someone in the depths of their despair is never easy. I guess he was at a loss at how best to comfort me, even though he was sharing in my grief, for he had loved Harry very much. He had got Harry's paintings framed for me, so that I would always be able to look at them and remember my son. But how could I ever forget him? He was alive in my heart. People kept reassuring me that with time the dreadful pain would become more bearable, but each day would drag along so warily, almost as if every single second was like a life sentence for me. It was even a challenge just to breathe. If I had my way, I'd have buried myself under my Egyptian cotton sheets and remained there until the end of time. Every morning I was rudely awoken by the sharp pins of the fierce shooting pains of the horror that played out for me on that rainy, inauspicious day that I'd never ever been allowed to forget, as the memory clung to me like a blood-sucking leech. The police had been desperately kind to me, reassuring me that they would catch the negligent hit-and-run driver that ran down my son in the middle of the road. But there had been no breakthroughs in the investigation. There were articles in the Toronto papers, of course, about my son's tragic passing, but no one came forward as a witness concerning the event. Even Eleanor Madison, the biggest busybody living in our street, admitted that at the time of the accident she happened to be enjoying a hot bubble bath in her home, so she could not tell the police anything about the woman that had run my son over. I have no doubt that such an astute woman as herself, had she been around, she'd have been able to give the police the model of the car and the number plate of the vehicle. But sadly, she had chosen a very bad time to enjoy a bubble bath. The radio was ablaze with discussions about the hit-and-run accident, with all kinds of phone-ins. "Well, I blame the mother," came one voice. "I mean, it was bucketing down there with rain, for goodness sake, and she lets her child run into the road like that. She was responsible for the child's behaviour." "Well, I blame the hit-and-run driver. What kind of a person drives off after hitting a 5-year-old child? This person is the lowest form of life, the scum of our society." So you can see, even on local Toronto radio, I was being clandestinely judged as a bad, irresponsible mother for letting my son go into the middle of the road to chase after his painting. But it had happened so quickly, I had no way of stopping it, and since the event, I'm glad to say, a couple of speed bumps had been erected into the road, on the insistence of the local authorities, who said that with the zebra crossing outside the nursery school, it wasn't enough protection for the children, so the entire road needed speed bumps to ensure that people never speeded down it again, unless they wanted to seriously damage their cars. On the side of the road, adjacent to where my son had lost his life so tragically, people like an army of ants had crowded the pavement with teddy bears and flowers to remember little Harry by. Someone had made a big plaque saying, "Harry, rest in peace. You were taken from us far too young, but you will never, ever be forgotten." Never was a truer word ever spoken. Everyone in my neighbourhood had been so kind to me, including my immediate next-door neighbours, the Fenters, who shared the other side of my Victorian home with me. The vegan couple kept dropping over vegetable lasagnas for me, and tomato pastas that my brother Marcus ended up eating instead of me. I wanted to eat, I rarely did, but it was like my jaws were locked together, and my appetite had abandoned me. I would be lucky if I managed a mouthful of pasta, but over the course of the next month, casseroles descended on our doorstep like manna from heaven. The food was so good that in those 6 weeks, it was my brother Marcus who probably gained about 20 pounds. I do remember I talked to the police. When they'd finished their inquiries, I'm sure they must have thought I was a dreadful witness, for I could barely remember anything about the hit-and-run driver, apart from seeing the woman's face, of which I did remember clearly, and a sketch artist was intending to draw it, but when she finished her sketch, it didn't look anything like the woman I remembered. You'd think I'd feel an intense hatred towards the woman that ran over my son, but for reasons I cannot comprehend, I did not. I suppose I did realise it was all a dreadfully unfortunate accident. "But, ma'am, do you not remember the make of the car? Or perhaps the colour? That would help us a great deal in our investigation. Do you recall if there was any damage on the car, on the windscreen perhaps?" To those questions I had absolutely no answers. "I'm sorry, officer, I can't remember very much. It was pouring down with rain. I think the car might have been a dark colour, but I'm not sure. I do remember the driver was female. I remember her face quite well. She looked terribly frightened." "I bet she did," grunted the officer. "The woman ran over your son and killed him. She should be locked away for good. Shame on her. I can't abide people not taking responsibility for their own actions. She will be arrested, and when she is, she's going to pay for what she's done." I would have given up on myself and my life if it was not for the new addition that arrived so unexpectedly on the scene, like a life-giving breath of fresh air that dabbed the antiseptic of hope on my deep festering internal wounds. This elixir of hope had been scratching on our door at about midnight, on the very day that Harry died. It was the dog I'd considered rescuing and adopting as my own, when I'd passed him, in the rain, while walking to the Peter Pan nursery school. But the dog had been in fear of me, and had run away, but now it was back, seemingly determined to get my attention. Curtis Barry had given me some of his sleeping tablets to take, that the doctor prescribed to him for his insomnia, to help me sleep through the night, but I couldn't sleep as the pain of losing my beloved son Harry had overcome the sedative powers in those pills. I always believed that Harry sent that dog to me after his passing. It was the emaciated dog I had seen, desperately looking for food in the bin liners that Mr. Booth had tossed outside his front door. It was probably more than his tired legs could bear to make it to the main bin. I had brought the uncertain, disquieted dog into my home, and unlike the first time that I'd seen him, when he'd hurriedly scrambled off in terror to get away from me, this time he began to slowly and surely trust me, as if he suddenly recognized I really was trying to help him, and was investing all my hope in him. In my despair, helping the scraggy skeletal dog make a full recovery, that I decided to call Georgie Boy, helped me to overcome my own personal grief, as my attention was focused on something other than myself, and that really helped me. 2 months later, Georgie Boy was barely recognizable as the same dog. He had grown into a spectacular-looking animal, with a gloriously glossy coat. One thing that remained unchanged was that he was ever so grateful to me for having rescued him. He knew unequivocally that I'd saved his life, so he was so devoted to me. But what Georgie Boy failed to realize, in the same breath, he actually saved my life. I was forever taking him into my arms for a cuddle, and he would cover me with his sloppy kisses, and those were the only moments when my grim, sorrowful face would actually show a smile. When I visited the pet shop in town to get Georgie Boy kitted out with a brand new collar and lead, something peculiar happened. When the pet shop owner herself went to the back of the shop, she said she had to get a designer collar for me that she thought would be absolutely perfect for my dog. "I don't know why," she said, shaking her head vigorously. "It's come in about, a few days ago, and I haven't unpacked it yet. But for some reason I feel compelled to show you this one. Goodness knows why. The designer who created this particular collar told me that when she was making it, she was inspired by an inner voice that told her to make it exactly like this." To my amazement, the collar was covered with a lady beetle design. I stared at the lady beetle design in stunned awe. "I know," said the woman, looking at my shiny eyes. "It's lovely, isn't it? I knew you would like it. I do like the lady beetle design. So ingenious, don't you think? For some reason I thought it was perfect for your dog." I could not help shivers from going down my spine, but good ones, because I felt that this was another sign from my son Harry, who loved all lucky symbols. He was telling me he was still very much around. Naturally, I bought the collar at once, and I knew it was from Harry, who I believe had sent Georgie Boy to me in the first place. I would still frequently go into Harry's bedroom to smell his clothes. I wanted to breathe him in. I tried not to think of the moment they lowered his small white casket into the ground. Those are the kind of haunting memories I wanted to blot out, and I still had not visited the tombstone at the local cemetery, where many well-wishers laid flowers and teddy bears at his grave. I wanted to visit him at the cemetery, really I did, but I couldn't bring myself to do it, because my son was lying there, buried 6 feet under. It was too raw for me to do that at this point in time, as it was like admitting to myself that Harry was never ever coming back. The police had not been remotely successful in their inquiries, and of course I cannot remember a thing. I do of course remember a flashback through that windscreen window when I saw that woman's face, and the terrified pair of eyes that stared back at me when the woman comprehended exactly what she'd done. By the sound of my son's skull hitting the tarmac, she would almost certainly have known that she had killed him. I remember she'd skirted away in her car as fast as she possibly could. I'm sure by now she knew she had caused my child's death, given it had been all over the Toronto Star and Tribune. I wonder how she can live with herself, given what she's done, I thought. I mean, surely the guilt has got to be eating away at her. As I was meditating over these disquieting thoughts, and thinking about the woman that had run over my son, there came a knock at the front door. I reluctantly sashayed over to answer it. I didn't feel like receiving any visitors, but people had been so kind to me in this neighbourhood, it would be rude not to invite them in to enjoy a coffee, although I would rather do nothing but stare blankly into space. Angie Barry was standing in the doorway. She was a very elegant woman, always dressed in vintage-looking clothes that rather reminded me of what women wore in the 1950s. Her auburn curly hair framed her pretty face, as her blue eyes stared at me with genuine concern in their depths. In her manicured slim hand, she was carrying a steaming pot of food, that when Georgie boy smelt it, he barked appreciatively, with his tail thumping excitedly, as if he was anticipating leftovers. Normally Georgie boy got plenty of leftovers, so he had every right to be optimistic in this regard. Angie Barry is Curtis Barry's wife. He's the one who doesn't know how to stop talking. He owns Lulu the greyhound, and is half deaf, so he wears a hearing aid, and it is rumoured he doesn't know how to turn the thing up. I open the door and Angie Barry elegantly swans right past me, inviting herself into my house, without even being asked. There is a determined look on her face that I've never seen before. I follow her into the kitchen, and the billowing steam that emerges from her casserole smells absolutely delicious. Georgie boy pads by my side. Angie begins to order me around in a loving matriarch manner. "Will you set the table, love? I decided that I'm going to eat with you today. I'm sure you could do with some good company. I hope you don't mind me inviting myself to join you. But you and we've got things to talk about." "We have?" I asked, wondering where this conversation was leading. "Plenty to talk about, love." "But I'm not hungry," I said in protest. Angie smiles at me warmly. "That's a maybe, love. But I assure you, you think you're not hungry. But you will be ravenously hungry once you've tasted my delicious meatloaf. I understand from Curtis that he's been giving you the secret ingredients to all my recipes over the years. Honestly, that husband of mine is the absolute end." Angie rolls her eyes in the back of her head in exasperation. "I mean, secrets are supposed to be kept, are they not? Not my husband, though. He spills them all so shamelessly." "Well, I can't remember any of your secret recipes that he told me," I assured her. "I'm not surprised, love. My husband can get awfully boring when he drones on and on about everything and nothing. I always tell him, 'Curtis, people don't want to listen to you reading the Encyclopedia Britannica to them. They just want light-hearted, happy conversation. But that incorrigible man never listens to a word I say.'" I chuckled. "He doesn't half talk." "You're not kidding. He could talk the hide of an elephant. But I'll tell you one thing. He's right on the money about my meatloaf. I don't normally blow my own trumpet. But when it comes to my meatloaf, I don't believe in being remotely bashful or restrained in my enthusiasm towards it. Wait until you take the first bite. You will see exactly what I'm talking about. My grandmother perfected this recipe. It was passed down our family line for generations. And I'm yet to taste a meatloaf that compares with this one." I smiled at Mrs. Barry's enthusiasm, and I appreciated her efforts to put meat on my bones. But I couldn't remember the last time I'd actually sat down and eaten a half-decent square meal, since my son's death, as I'd been nibbling like a little church mouse. I didn't want to be rude to this kind woman, who was going to so much trouble on my behalf. I was touched to the quick by her kindness towards me. Ever since Harry died, the couple had been shopping for me, and Mr. Barry had been maintaining the front yard, refusing to accept any payment for his troubles, and the front yard had never looked more beautiful. He even went to the local nursery to buy some colourful perennials for me, so that I had the showiest displays in the entire neighbourhood, better than his own. I watched as Mrs. Barry put some meatloaf on my plate, along with some mashed potatoes and vegetables. She presented it in front of me, and sat down opposite me, with her plate piled high with steaming food. The steam rises above my plate in a large vaporous cloud. The smell is delicious, but I'm still not hungry. "I didn't put a lot on your plate, dear. I don't want to overwhelm you. Are you going to at least have a little bite? I want some feedback on my meatloaf, don't I? I need you to try it." I'm sitting back at the table, wrestling with my knife and fork, and apprehensively taking a tiny nibble of the meatloaf, as if I'm a suspicious kid trying spinach for the very first time, and certain that I'm going to spit it all out. The meatloaf melts into my mouth like butter. It is so tender and moist. The flavours and the full-bodied taste gives me a great deal of pleasure. My whole body groans in appreciation. Without saying a word, I hungrily tuck into Mrs. Barry's meatloaf, as if I'm a half-starved orphan that hasn't eaten for a month. But in a manner of speaking, I probably am. "That is what I like to see, dear," said Mrs. Barry, watching me scrape my plate clean. "I always appreciate it when someone enjoys their food. I thought you said you weren't hungry, but I told you that my meatloaf will always wake up your hunger. Would you like some more, dear?" I nodded and then remembered my manners. "Mrs. Barry, your meatloaf is the best I've ever tasted," and I meant it. "Did I not tell you that this is the world's best meatloaf?" she said, presenting me with another plate of meatloaf and mashed potatoes. And if that was not enough, she placed a strawberry cheesecake she had made herself in front of me, and to my amazement I gobbled that up, and I felt a whole lot better, as if my entire body, that had been starved for so long, was appreciating the calories it had been denied. "Oh, I am so pleased to see you eat something, love. You've been losing far too much weight. Me and the husband have been so worried about your health. I don't think it's doing you any favours staying around here, reliving your memories. Have you thought of getting away perhaps for a while from this neighbourhood, I mean? It might do you the world of good, you know." "But I can't afford it," I told her honestly. "I mean, of course I've got money in the bank, savings and that, but I haven't been working, so I need to be mindful of everything I spend. Of course Marcus is paying for stuff and that helps a lot, but I don't want to go back to my photography until I'm in a better place. So I just have to be very mindful of everything I spend." "But that's my point, love. You're not eating very much, are you? There's no colour in your cheeks, and there's no life to your energy. You really need to get away. And I've been discussing this matter with Curtis, my husband. We believe we have a sound idea for you, that we hope you will accept on our behalves. We happen to have a holiday cabin in Banff, Alberta. Why don't you stay there for a while, as long as you like? I'm sure you've been to Alberta before, so you know it's an idyllic part of the world. The town of Banff, of course, is a tourist's dream. It's like something out of a picture postcard. It's exquisite." "You've got a cabin in Banff?" I asked. "Yes, we have. My husband's parents lived in the cabin for many years, you know. It's well kitted out, exquisite views over the mountains, a very peaceful location. I just think getting away for you would do you the world of good. If you get lonely, you can always go shopping to the local town. There are all kinds of things you can do there. I just believe that being around the natural world is very healing for a ruptured soul like yourself. And given what you've been through, this is exactly what you need." "But I can't possibly impose on your kind hospitality, Mrs. Barry. I wouldn't dream of it. You have already done far too much for me." "Don't be ridiculous, love. You're not imposing on anyone. The very idea is ridiculous. If you would like a lovely break away from the neighbourhood, it won't cost you a penny, apart from your food costs, of course. But there's a very well-stocked pantry inside the cabin, with long-life stuff you can help yourself to. But as far as fresh produce is concerned, you'll need to go to the local town for that. But I am quite sure the crisp mountain air will do you the world of good and help you to emotionally heal, and we all want to see that happen for you. Georgie boy will be in his element if he goes along with you. You can take him on long leisurely walks in the woodgrove if you like. We can get special permission for you to take Georgie boy with you as a companion for your emotional healing. Failing that, we can make some other plan for you. There are always ways around the system. It will be a lovely escape for the both of you, I'm quite sure. And if you come back with rosy pink in your cheeks, I will be thrilled." Angie Barry took my hand in hers. "And as far as the flight is concerned, dear, that's all in apple pie order. We've got that sorted for you, because we would like to give you this trip as a gift from us. I know I can't claim to know what you're going through, love. Losing a child has got to be the worst thing that can possibly happen to anyone. But if I know anything about that little boy of yours, it would absolutely break his heart to see you so broken up. He would want you to recover from everything that's happened. He doesn't want you to be upset. Don't let this tragedy define you." Mrs. Barry took me into her arms and held me tightly. "So are you going to take up my offer or not?" "In the circumstances, I don't think I can possibly refuse." 2 months earlier, Alicia Bennett's account. I didn't enjoy my trips to Toronto very much. It would take me 36 hours to get there if I went by car, so I always took a flight there and left my car at the airport. While I was in Toronto, my brother gave me full use of his second-hand car, which was awfully useful for me. I did have to make this trip to Toronto, I'm afraid. It couldn't be helped. My father had died a month ago. I had to spend some time in Toronto sorting out his affairs so that me and my brother Rick could put his house on the market as soon as possible. My mother currently lived with me and my husband in our country home in Alberta, as we were so incredibly close. I couldn't envisage her not sharing a house with us. My parents had long since divorced, as my mother and father could not see eye to eye about anything, so the relationship had finally fallen apart, with both of my parents choosing to go their separate ways, which was the best decision they could have ever made, as they really were not suited to each other. I suspected my late father had thought my mother was pretty when he met her all those years ago, because she could clean and cook, and that had ticked all his marriage suitability boxes. But he had failed to realize that relationships are much more about sharing things in common than whether you look pretty on the outside packaging or not, because eventually that is going to come under some wear and tear with the passing of time, so focusing on the outside veneer is not going to guarantee a happy ever after. I guess my father learnt those unfortunate truths the hard way. Growing up, my relationship with my dad had been a little on the taxing side, as I always got the sense my father was a bit of a misogynist, as anything women could do, men could always do infinitely better. I remember he was mortified one day when I suggested I could go fishing with him and my brother, as if my very presence would somehow ruin the whole outing for them, as a female energy might actually scare all the fish away. "Look, love," he had said as politely as he could, "fishing is not a woman's sport. How about you learn to bake something with your mother in the kitchen? I'm sure she can teach you some nice recipes. Maybe when we get back from our fishing expedition, you can surprise us with a nice cake. If you want to know the truth, I'm quite partial to a very good rum barber, but go generously with the rum. That's what I say." I think my father mistakenly believed the best place for a woman was pregnant, barefoot, and in the kitchen, if you get my drift. I think my father's apathetic insouciance towards women may have been one of the very reasons my mother chose to leave him in the first place. I think she had felt invisible in the relationship, almost as if she didn't exist. My father probably treated her more like a glorified cleaner than his own wife. My father and my brother Rick had always got along together famously, like a house on fire. Both of them were passionate about golf, and could be seen out on the golfing green on a Saturday morning together, regular as clockwork, trying their best to get that quintessential hole-in-one. To be fair, my late father and my brother were exceptionally good golf players, I'll give that to them. They would spend the weekends together as if they were the oldest of friends, so they had a fabulous relationship, which I envied greatly. I will admit I did feel left out, as if my dad and brother were part of an exclusive club in which I did not belong and could never gain membership of. I knew that my brother Rick was my dad's favourite, but being female I couldn't hope to compete in the first place. But if I had been a boy, that would have been a different ballgame altogether. I was naturally sad when my father passed away, even though he could be stubbornly opinionated at the very best of times. Despite everything, I had loved him very much. He was my own flesh and blood, after all. Yes, he had stiff, rather rigid, old-fashioned ideas about women's roles in society, and yes, he could be as tough as old boots, but I considered him to still be my beloved father, who was very special to me. Even my mother shed a tear or two after learning the tragic news of his fortuitous demise that none of us ever saw coming. Despite everything, she also had loved him once. "Silly old fool," she said. "Silly, silly old fool. He should have looked after himself better. All that drinking and cigarette smoking, not to mention unhealthy eating practices. Well, I think they finally caught up with him in the end. I told him he needed to take better care of himself. But he told me his declining health was all my fault, because I wasn't cooking him home-cooked meals any longer, after we split up. I'm sure it's true, I said. Dad certainly went on the decline after you left him, Mum. I don't know why he didn't get a domesticated worker to cook him healthy meals, or at the very least attend a cookery course, to learn how to cook for himself, so he didn't have to rely on such a lousy diet. He might still be around if that were the case. I told you, repeated my mother, shaking her head furiously. Your father was a silly old fool. He should have at least got remarried after I left him. But no, he thought he could look after himself. And unfortunately, that's where he fell apart. He had no clue how to look after himself. Me and my brother Rick agreed to clean out my dad's house. This was the original family home where I'd grown up as a little girl. It embodied beloved, wistful, nostalgic memories of my early years spent in this green leafy neighbourhood that was as prepossessing as ever. We had agreed to put the house on the market. It was in reasonably good shape and would fetch a sizable amount of money for us, but it had, of course, accumulated a lot of stuff over the years that needed to be thrown out, like old Christmas decorations, boxes of redundant things that were no longer usable in this day and age, stuff like that. I was staying at my brother Rick's house in Toronto with his wife Sue and their adorable 2 children, Eddie and Tessa. It was decided that both Rick and I would work together on this industrious project, which we hoped would be completed within 3 days. The very slick estate agents we were dealing with were zealously eager to put the house on the market as soon as possible, to stage it to the public, but that could not be done until my father's clutter was ruthlessly dealt with. I'm glad to say my dad wasn't exactly a hoarder, but he did have things that needed tossing out, and a whole lot of paperwork that necessitated sifting through very carefully in case there were any important documents we were obliged to salvage. My brother Rick had faithfully promised to help me with cleaning out my father's house. We knew this was going to be a tediously dull, very monotonous job that would not be for the faint of heart, as sorting out somebody else's mess never is. Of course, there would be stuff that we would be sifting through that stretched back to our childhood years, from kiddies' books to toys, but that went with the territory of a thorough clean-out, as when it comes to a major move, any potential buyers of the property would want to be creating their own memories, and certainly not inheriting ours. I had been in Toronto for 3 days, and had laboriously, painstakingly progressed rather successfully in sorting through my dad's stuff. But Rick failed to arrive on the scene to help me out, as he had promised to do so. I was getting increasingly annoyed and frustrated by his insouciant procrastination. This was so typical of his character. Why was I not remotely surprised by this? Even as a kid, he had artfully wormed his way out of doing almost everything that required hard work and laborious effort. He would mysteriously vanish into thin air when anything unpleasant needed to be undertaken, like cleaning out his bedroom or helping to sift out the junk from the garage. On this occasion, Rick had barely lifted a finger to help me. He was being a little evasive, rather like my late father, expecting the woman to do all the dirty work on his behalf, and disappearing at the earliest convenience. He kept making up a plethora of ambiguous excuses as to why he couldn't be on hand to help me, from having a banging headache to a dreadful stomach cramp that came on him ever so suddenly after eating a burger on the run. Sis, I'm sorry I can't come around to help you now. I've got the most dreadful stomach cramps. Goodness gracious me, they're unbearable. I ate something very dodgy in that burger. I think there may have been jalapeno peppers in it, and that does my stomach no good at all. I feel quite ill. I need to let the stomach settle for a while, but I'll be with you shortly, I can promise you that. Then there was something urgent that suddenly popped up, like a cuckoo from a clock, that demanded his immediate attention. Sis, I'm sorry. I know I promised to help you, but you see, something's come up again. I promised an old friend of mine I'd meet up with him. He's going through a very tough time. I really need to help him. The excuses were endless, and seemed to rain down from heaven like the first flurry of winter snow, so that my brother's artful avoidance tactics meant I was doing all the hard graft myself on this clean-up project, so I was feeling very aggrieved and hard done by. It was 3 o'clock in the afternoon, on my third and final day of my stay in Toronto, when my brother Rick finally rocked up at my father's house. At least he had the good grace to look rather bashful and sheepish about his zero contribution in helping me out over the last 3 days, where we could have made incredible progress with all hands on deck. For indeed, had my brother had the good grace to actually be around, the disagreeable job would be long since over and done with, and my late father's house would be ready to be staged by the estate agents. I regret to say I was not remotely amused by his apathy. I'd been working doggedly hard for the last 3 days, without even stopping to draw breath. I was exceedingly peeved that all my brother's vague, rather obsolete promises to help had been as flimsy as a cling film covering over a bowl of leftovers. I was exhausted by this point, with all the organising and sorting out that I had done. I had become grumpy, and was not nurturing a good mood by any manner of means, nor was I kindly disposed towards my brother. I hasten to say I did not hold back on my festering indignation. I could feel the bubbles of anger rising up inside me, like the effervescence in a fizzy drink. I was covered in dust from head to toe, having climbed up in the attic to remove all manner of stuff that needed sorting out. I had smeared dirt all over my face, and the remnants of spider webs and dust were clinging to my clothes. I was sure I was a sight for sorry eyes. I felt it too. I could have done with a lovely hot bath. I was grubby and filthy dirty, but equally as determined to soldier along and get as much stuff done as I possibly could before catching my flight to Calgary. "What time do you think this is, Rick?" I snapped at him, in a curt, accusatory tone of voice, pointing to my watch. "It's 3 o'clock. Need I remind you that you agreed to be here by 8 this morning?" "Let me guess," I said sarcastically. "You had to take a trip to the moon to discuss the next NASA launch site. Is that it? Or you had to fly away to a magical faraway land on a flying carpet at a moment's notice. Is that it?" "There's no need to be so sarcastic, sis. We've got all the time in the world to fix up Dad's house, have we not? Why all this tearing rush to get everything done so quickly?" I put my hands on my hips and glared furiously at my brother. "Are you forgetting something here? I came up all the way from Alberta to sort this stuff out. It was supposed to take 3 days. This is my final day here, and you've done bugger all to help me. A couch potato sitting on a couch in front of the television, eating a TV dinner, probably would have done more than you have. Need I remind you that you've been gone for 7 hours, and I could have seriously done with your help. Some of those boxes are heavy to lift, and I've been battling to carry them out to the skip that we hired. I'm covered in dust from top to toe. The attic was filthy, but there were lots of things that needed throwing out, and someone had to do it, didn't they?" "I'm very sorry, sis, but I told you I got waylaid. I can hardly help that, can I? You know how it is. That very good friend of mine, he's going through some emotional upheaval, some turmoil in his life. His wife walked out on him, so he's getting a divorce. I couldn't abandon him, could I? He needs my support at this difficult, tumultuous time for him." I scowled at my brother, glaring at him furiously. "Does this friend of yours actually exist, or are you making him up so that you can do the bare minimum to help me? Is that your plan? So you can get me to do all the donkey work around here, while you just sit back at home, or sit there on the golfing green, twiddling your fingers? Is that it?" "Of course I'm not making my friend up. I told you, he's in a very bad place. Didn't I say his wife walked out on him? He needs my support. How would you like it if your husband did the same to you? Why do you keep nagging me like this, sis? You're so unreasonable." "Why? Why do I keep nagging you?" I said, pointing a finger at my brother. "You really want the answer to that? I can't believe you have the gall to ask me that. I don't enjoy nagging you, but someone has to tell you how it is. You're damn lazy, that's why. It's like you want me to do everything, while you do nothing. That's what's really going on here. I'm not stupid, you know. I can read through the lines. Well, between the lines, that is. That's not fair, sis. I cannot help it, can I, if I've been very busy? Yesterday I ate that dreadful burger with the jalapeno peppers, and that was very bad on my stomach. I was very sick, cramping all day I was. I think it was contaminated. My stomach is still in a bad way, I'll have you know. One thing is for sure, I'm never going to go to that burger place again. They put too much chili in the burger. It's far too spicy. Well, isn't it interesting you should say all that? When I asked Sue, your wife, about your apparent stomach cramps, she told me that you hadn't mentioned them to her. The so-called spicy burger that you've eaten. She knew nothing about this mysterious bout of food poisoning you claimed to have acquired. She told me you had gone to play golf with a friend of yours, which I don't think you could have done with a dodgy stomach, do you? I didn't tell you about the burger because you know what my wife Sue is like. She hates it when I eat any fast food. She's very particular about our diet. But I really did have a bad stomach, sis. It was cramping up. You should have seen me. I was in a right old state, said my brother, clutching his stomach in exaggeration, as if the cramping had suddenly resurfaced. Come to think of it, I don't feel desperately well right now, he said with a pained expression on his face, as if expecting me to suddenly feel desperately sorry for him. I've got some pain going on in my stomach still, a few more cramps. I think I feel another one of those twitches coming on. Your stomach was so bad yesterday, was it, Rick, that you promptly decided to go and play golf with a friend? You've taken 3 days off work to help me, in case you've forgotten. You were not meant to go swanning off to the golfing green to play golf. My heart bleeds for you when you were hitting all those hole-in-ones with a stomach that was actually killing you. I wonder how you managed to actually do that. Please don't pick on me, sis. I can also feel my headache coming on. All that nagging brings on a migraine for me. Please, will you stop the nagging? Is that what you conveniently tell Sue when she needs your help in something? Your wife was telling me that she asked you to fix her broken kitchen cabinet 6 months ago. You still haven't attended to the matter. Fat lot of use you are, I said, shaking my head furiously. Look, Rick, this job needs to be done, whether you like it or not. And the fresh air is not going to do it for us. I need your help, or otherwise Dad's house is not going to sell itself, is it? You can make up all the fairy tale excuses you like in the world, Rick, until they're coming out of your ears. But by the end of the day, I'm leaving, whether you like it or not. I'm going to the airport. I will leave all the rest of the clean-up to you. It's only fair you do your share of the work. You so far have failed to lift a finger to help me. I'm exhausted and worn out, and frankly, I've had enough. But you can't do that, sis, said my brother, with panic beginning to register on his face, as if he was a dog that had been abandoned by his owner and tossed out of the car to fend for himself. You can't leave the rest of this job to me. That's not fair. You can't leave for Calgary today. There's still too much to be done around here. I think you'll find I can, Rick. Your second-hand SUV I borrowed is now packed with my suitcase, so I'm finished here. You can pick it up from the airport later. I have a flight to catch shortly. I told you that this morning at breakfast when I said my goodbyes to Sue and the kids. Or have you suitably forgotten about that? You knew very well I was leaving today, so don't pretend to be surprised all of a sudden. We could have both accomplished a great deal together if you'd stayed around to actually help me. I was only staying with you for 3 days. I've got to get back home now, Rick. I have a life to live, things to do. I can spare another hour, but that's it. So are you going to help me with the rest of this stuff or not? My brother's face looked reasonably apologetic. I just popped around to tell you that I'm meeting up with that friend right now, the one that's getting divorced. He's still in a very bad way, so I need to be there for him. So I can't help you right now, I'm afraid. He's in a bad place, is he? I snorted. That's rich. Well, I'll let you know something, Rick. He's not alone. A lot of people out there are in a bad place right now. And I'm also in a bad place, stuck here with you and your pitiful, pathetic excuses. Just so you know, I'm leaving right now. I'm not going to stand around to listen to you anymore. I've had enough. I'm going back to Alberta. You can sort the rest of this mess out yourself, all on your own. It should have been finished by now, if you hadn't messed me around in the way you did. I've done my share, and for your information, I don't believe any of the excuses you've been doling out towards me. Don't forget to pick up your SUV from the airport later on. I'm going now, I said, dropping the front door keys into Rick's hands. But you can't leave, said my brother, staring at me in bemusement, as I marched furiously to his second-hand car, not even bothering to turn around to acknowledge him. I was absolutely livid, very enraged. Any opportunity my brother got to postpone doing something, he would embrace, so he could avoid helping me. It was the story of his life. I know it wasn't a pleasant job, but we both agreed to get our hands dirty together and buckle down and do it. But no, my brother liked to avoid any hard work, and now he'd have to do the rest himself. I had done more than my share of this heavy workload, and my brother would have to make the house suitable for staging, all on his own, and good luck to him was all I could say. I was seething with an impassioned agitation that my brother had provoked within me, as I marvelled at his blatant audacity. I drove away, holding onto the steering wheel tightly, so that my white knuckles were peering obtrusively through my skin. I navigated my way through this prepossessing Toronto neighbourhood, frothing with inner rage. To match my mood, I could hear the angry drumroll of thunder in the background. Damn, I thought, it's going to rain. Just what I need. I observed grey thunder clouds hovering across the sky like dirty candy floss that is far too unpalatable to eat at a children's fair. It began to bucket down with rain, so that the beaded droplets of rain made my visibility rather poor. Even the windscreen wipers were working hard to fight back the deluge that unapologetically seemed to thunder down. I reduced my speed accordingly. I do not believe I was driving fast, but the glistening road was slippery and wet, so driving conditions became quite treacherous. In the most inopportune, inauspicious moment, a spider, probably from the attic, that had got on my clothes, began to crawl all over my face, and was now burrowing its way into my right eye. So I had to literally push it away. I was momentarily distracted as I tried to do that. My eyes began to weep and to stream, and then everything went badly wrong, like a scene from a horror movie that you never anticipated ever happening, that you cannot unsee, even though you wish you could wipe it off, like an ink spill on a writing desk that you blot away, almost as if it had never happened at all. But happen it did. It was as random and unexpected as the spider crawling up my face. A 5-year-old boy just ran into the road to chase after a large white piece of paper that was blowing away in the wind. The boy appeared from nowhere, like a random bird dropping, magically materializing on a windscreen window, when there seems to be no sign of a bird anywhere, although there was nothing auspicious about this sobering scenario. Moments before, the road was clear of all pedestrians and vehicles, and now a boy came out of nowhere. I couldn't stop in time, so I slammed on the brakes as hard as I possibly could. I tried to maneuver my car out of the way, but my attempts were futile and pathetic. My reaction time was seriously wanting. The boy was thrown from the windscreen onto the tarmac with a mighty walloping crash. I could see a pool of crimson blooming from out of his head on the road, as the poor mother, drenched to the skin from the rain, came running from the pavement. She dropped down on the road on all fours and began desperately cradling the limp body of her boy in her arms, screaming at the top of her lungs, "No! No, please, no! God, no! My baby! My baby!" For a second she looked up at me, and her terrified eyes bored into mine. And then, in the gravity of realizing what I'd done, I just knew I needed to get away from this harrowing scene as fast as I could. It was far too overwhelming for me to endure. I couldn't cope with this horrific reality. It was all too much to take on board. I needed to get away from here as fast as I could. Of course I knew what a responsible citizen should do. I knew I should get out of the car to assist the poor mother of the deceased child, offer her support, confess to the police what had happened. But I just couldn't do it. There was no way I could do it. I could feel the bitter taste of nausea rising up in the back of my throat. My whole body felt rigidly stiff and as unmalleable as a waxwork statue in Madame Tussauds. for I seemed incapable of getting out of my car to offer help, even if I'd wanted to. I just could not do it. I didn't have the emotional strength, the courage, or even the willingness to face this horror spread out before me on the road, like a piece of gruesome roadkill. I hurriedly reversed away and speeded like a bat out of hell, while the rain continued to beat down on my windscreen, as if shedding tears for the deceased little boy. I could only imagine what the poor mother was going through. I didn't want to imagine. I refused to allow myself to think about this too much. I knew leaving the mother alone on that road to deal with her grief was the most heartless, cruel thing to do. I'm not proud of what I did, but everything was so surreal. I began to wonder if it had happened at all. And boy, I wanted to believe with all my heart that this had all been a dreadful nightmare that had not really played out in my reality. I hurriedly reversed, speeding away like a bat out of hell, while the rain continued to beat down ominously on my windscreen, almost as if shedding tears for the deceased little boy. I could only imagine what the poor mother was going through right now. I refused to allow myself to even consider this. I knew leaving her alone to deal with her grief was the most heartless, cruel thing for me to do. I am not proud of what I did. Everything was so surreal. I began to wonder if it had happened at all. I wanted to believe with all my heart that this had all been a dreadful nightmare that had not really played out in my reality. What kind of a monster was I, driving away from a scene of an accident like this, with only a slight crack on my brother's windscreen to show for it? It was amazing that there was so little damage done to his car. I deserved to be punished for what I'd done. In that moment, I wished the whole world would fold up like a scroll, and that the memory of this poignant moment would drop off the page like a pressed wild flower, to be remembered no more. No one could hate or despise myself more than I did at this precise moment, but I lacked the courage to face up to the consequences of what I'd done, like a cowering dog hiding under the bed while the storm rages on and the thunder bangs formidably across the sky. The only way I can describe the way I was feeling at this moment was like a hunted animal being pursued by a deadly predator. All I could do was continue to drive on, as if my very life depended on it, until I finally reached the airport. I recall the abundant streams of sweat that were pouring down my back, even though it wasn't a hot day, and my fingers on the steering wheel became slippery. For a long while I sat in my brother's car, staring vacantly into space, not knowing what to do about what had recently transpired. I trembled as I fiddled with my phone, begging myself to summon the courage to call the police, to admit to what I'd done. But I failed to find the strength. I was too much of a coward for that. It was hard to imagine that I was responsible for this little boy's tragic death. I reluctantly leave my brother's second-hand car in the airport, and a message behind on his phone to give him the details of how to collect his car. I also apologized for the unfortunate crack to his windscreen and offered to pay for the damages. I knew my brother would probably leave the windscreen exactly like this for a long time, without bothering to get it fixed. Hell would likely freeze over before my brother fixed the problem, especially on a second-hand car that he barely used. He probably wouldn't even bother to ask me what had happened to the windscreen for it to crack like that. For once in my lifetime, I was grateful for my brother's insouciance. He was like a piece of driftwood, floating on the ocean, going where the current would take him, and being fine where he washed up. But if there was a golfing green somewhere around, even better. That was my brother for you, carefree and untroubled. He was one of those people that never got upset about anything, unless he had to work hard for something. When I boarded the plane to Calgary, which was over 4 hours, it may as well have been 100 lifetimes, for it certainly felt like that. I was tormented by the dramatic, gruesome imagery of the poor child hitting the windscreen window and violently crashing on the tarmac. I kept replaying the incident over and over again in my head, clandestinely wiping away the tears that had gathered in my eyes. The man sitting next to me on the aircraft handed me a tissue and kept asking me if I was all right, and I insisted that I was, but I was far from all right. All I could think about was that poor mother, desperately running into the road to retrieve what was left of her beloved son. What the hell had I done? Why had I not got out of the car to help her? Why had I been such a coward, so desperately afraid? I kept cursing myself for my atrocious behaviour. I had known at once that the little boy was dead, as the blooming blood that pooled from under his head, and the gazed eyes that stared up into space, while it continued to rain, had told me all I needed to know. The mother's distraught expression as she held my gaze was one that unequivocally I knew would haunt me for the rest of my days. I couldn't help but wonder if there would ever be peace in my heart again. I would never forget that agonized face. I could probably pick that woman up in a police lineup without any difficulty at all. The dreadful reality was I was the one that had killed this poor little boy. I could not get my head around this anomaly, and the gruesome, lurid, macabre details that would likely be splashed all over the Toronto Tribune in the morning. I was certain people would be quick to comment on the dreadful monster that had driven off after running over the little boy. The police would be likely looking for me. I was the kind of person that got upset by an animal being killed in a wildlife documentary. I remember I used to think that hit-and-run drivers were the lowest of the low, the cockroaches of society, who failed to take responsibility for what they'd done. But now I was one of them myself, and I barely recognized the person I'd become. When I disembarked from the plane and retrieved my car at the airport in Calgary, where it had been left for the last 3 days, I was so glad to get in something that smelt so familiar and to sink back into the comfortable leather seats I knew so well. I finally drove to my home, not far away from the charming little town of Banff. But I didn't even indulge myself in the radio. I drove back in a stiff, uncongenial silence, entertained only by the horrors of a day I wished that I could unlive. The journey home would likely take over an hour and a half. I was not comfortable driving late at night, but right now I didn't care about those supercilious things. All I wanted to do above anything else in the world was get back to the safe security of my warm, loving and welcoming home that would help me to blot out the rest of the world. I began weaving down the familiar roads that gestured me towards home, but even in the pitch black, I was like a homing pigeon. I knew exactly how to get back to my roosting place, as if my interior navigational radar was as sharp as a hawk, directing me almost supernaturally down sequestered country roads. Everything looked like cardboard cutouts on the horizon, and it was only my headlights that blazed through the darkness, along with the generous, reluctant offerings of a rather reticent moon, that lit up my path ahead. My car soon made the turning down the long curvaceous road through the trees that led directly to the family farmhouse. Never more in my life had I wanted to be home more than I did right now. I dreamed of a long, leisurely sleep that would block out the memories of what had recently transpired. It was as I was driving down our familiar earthen driveway that I immediately braked the car. It shuddered to a violent stop. In the middle of the driveway, at this very inauspicious late hour of the night, that would have intimidated those who are afraid of the dark, as it was velvety. The sky was studded with a few stars that looked far away and distant in the firmament. There was a gargantuan figure standing up on 2 feet in the middle of the driveway, covered with long flowing dark hair. I could see these yellow eyes staring straight at me. What the hell is that? I thought. What the bloody hell is that? There is no way it could possibly be a bear. I inched steadily forward, very gingerly in my car, my eyes scrunching up into narrow slits to get a much better view of this thing that I was scrutinizing. I was expecting the creature would just scoot away as soon as my car crawled cautiously forwards, but it just stood there resolutely in the driveway, staring straight at me, not seeming to feel the need to go away. My heart began to flutter violently in my chest, like a frantic pigeon. Should I be worried? Should I be afraid? Did this thing, whatever it was, impose a threat to me? I was now seriously only 3 feet away from this idiosyncratic creature, whatever on earth it was. My SUV stopped abruptly. my headlights, including the gossamer prisms of light offered by a rather evasive moon, enabled me to see this huge thing in its full glory, so I could take it all in spectacularly and remember every last detail. To my astonishment, I realized I was staring at a Bigfoot, and this powerful, majestic beast was clearly all male, as the energy he exuded was masterfully masculine. We both locked eyes with each other, and in that brief moment my fear was completely expunged, for I had seen warmth, kindness, and genuine concern in those deep, dark, soulful eyes. I heard in my head, "Welcome back home." The creature then promptly marched past me nonchalantly, swinging his arms and legs, and just gliding away into the heart of the woods. It was almost as if meeting me down our driveway at the dead of night was the most natural thing in the world to do. Yet I'd never seen this Bigfoot a day in my life, but it was almost as if this creature knew all about me and could see into the very depths of my soul. I was so confounded and bewildered that in one day not only had I killed a little 5-year-old boy, but I'd also stumbled across a Bigfoot on the driveway on my way back to the house. It was an extraordinary set of circumstances to happen within one day. Two unlikely, very incongruous events, playing out simultaneously into my own reality. Could I be forgiven at this point for believing I had momentarily been flung into a parallel universe? "Oh, thank God you're back," said my mother, who practically pounced on me the moment I opened the front door. I realized she'd been waiting up for me. She was wearing a toweling robe over her nightdress and promptly ferried me into the kitchen, grabbing me by the hand and insisting I left my luggage behind in the car. She studied me curiously, and a frown developed on her weathered face, as if the very sight of me brought her great disquiet. "Look at you, love. You look as if the entire Empire State Building has come crashing down on your very shoulders. Was it really that bad, cleaning up after your father? I might have known." She pulled a face. "I know he's not the tidiest of men. I did warn you that you might have a job on your hands, did I not? Well, I hope that your brother pulled his weight. But if I know Rick, he'd have done anything to avoid lending a helping hand." "It was a big job," I managed to say. "Rick was as useful as an upside-down sloth swinging from the branches. He didn't help me at all." My mother groaned. She rolled her eyes in the back of her head in exasperation. "What do they say? Like father, like son. I might have known that Rick would be completely useless. Honestly, I don't know how Sue puts up with that man. That woman has her work cut out for her, while Rick spends every opportunity playing golf, just like your father would do." "Well," I said rather flatly, "that's pretty much what happened, Mum. Rick pretended to have a dodgy stomach ache while he went off to play golf with a friend. I got most of the stuff done at the house, but there's still quite a lot to do. But I'm leaving Rick to sort that out, and I made that clear to him." "Good on you, love. I'm proud of you. Rick has got to learn that he cannot expect you to do everything for him. Sooner or later, he's going to have to learn to pull his weight. If there was an award in the Guinness Book of Records for the laziest man in the entire world, that man would surely win it. Oh dear, look at me going on and on like this, ranting like a fishwife. It's been such a long trip for you. Even a flight can wear you out. My goodness, I don't remember the last time I saw you looking this pale. Your clothes, well, they do look rather dirty. I'm surprised they let you get on board that flight, looking like that. You look like a feather duster that hasn't been cleaned out after all the dusting's been done in the house." "That's because I was in the attic. There was so much dust up there. It was dreadful." "Where is Adam?" I asked, referring to my husband. "Your husband is up in bed, fast asleep. He did set the alarm to wake up for when you arrived because he was so eager to see you. We've missed you so much. But you know him. He could sleep through a whirlwind. Would you like some hot chocolate, love, before you retire to bed? I'm sure you need some sustenance. You poor thing. You look absolutely shattered. I don't remember ever seeing you look quite so tired. You're completely washed out. I blame Rick for that. Honestly, I could box that man's ears. Are you sure you're all right? You look as if you're trembling, love. Something hasn't happened, has it? She asked, almost as if she'd sensed something about me was really off, even though I did my level best to hide all my distress. You don't know the half of it, I said. But chocolate, well, that will be very nice, Mum. Do you want to talk about it, love? Whatever it is, it's good to get it off your chest, you know. I'd rather not talk about it, Mum, if you don't mind. It'll make things 1,000 times worse for me. Oh, dear, that does sound ominous. You can talk to me whenever you like, love, said my mother, looking slightly disquieted. You know I'm here for you whenever you need me. And whatever it is, you know a problem shared is a problem halved. After the delicious hot chocolate that I'd enjoyed with my mother, I trailed up to my bedroom, dragging my tired legs behind me up the stairs, as if I was climbing the last part of the journey in Mount Everest. I tiptoed into my bedroom, relieved to discover my husband was fast asleep. Thankfully, he did not stir when I climbed under the sheets next to him. Before I knew it, I'd fallen into a blissfully deep sleep. At least with my eyes shut, I could get away from the haunting, grotesque imagery that had constantly replayed itself to me during the flight and on my journey back home. I do not know how I got through the next few days. I guess everything was just robotic. I got up, ate dinner, went to bed, and for once in my life the daily routines of life served me well, offering me the distractions I desperately needed to stop thinking about what I'd done. But when the memory of that inauspicious event replayed itself in my mind again, it felt as if I was being stung by 1,000 scorpions. It was all just a blur to me, getting vaguer and vaguer on my mind. But when my mother had opened the paper to read an article about a hit and run in Toronto, that was when I just crumbled and fell apart. I completely broke down, like a river beginning to flood its banks that you have no way of actually controlling. "Goodness gracious me," said my mother, as she sat at the breakfast table with her newspaper spread out before her, while she enjoyed a steaming mug of coffee. "Look at this! It's a hit and run in Toronto. It must have been around about the time you were there, love," she said, looking at me from above her paper. "How dreadfully sad! Can you believe it? A 5-year-old boy was mown down by a driver in the rain, and the driver simply drove away. I mean, who does that? The poor mother was a woman called Ella McIntosh. Quite an unusual name, don't you think? She says her little son, Harry, ran into the road to chase after his painting that he'd done at a local nursery school, and this car appeared from nowhere. She did recall the driver of the hit and run was a woman, but she cannot remember the make or the model of the car. It says here there are no witnesses to the event. It was pouring with rain at the time, and it was a very quiet neighbourhood. How tragic to lose her boy like that, don't you think? What a dreadfully sad story." I began to blubber. Tears spilled down my cheeks, and a strange howling sound emerged from the back of my throat. "Mum, it was me. I was the one that killed the boy. It was me." My mother cupped her hands over her mouth, and my husband, who was eating scrambled eggs at the time, nearly choked on them as they went down his throat the wrong way. He began to cough and splutter, and took a big swig of orange juice to help everything go down more smoothly. He stared at me with wide, horrified eyes, and looked as if someone had hit him across the head with an ice pick. "It was you, love?" asked my mother. "What happened?" Through floods of tears, I told my astonished mother and husband exactly what had happened that fateful day. I didn't spare them any details. It was actually good to unveil my guilt, and to get this horrifying secret I had been carrying, that had been festering away inside of me, off my chest. Well, it was just such a horrible day. It was just the worst day of my life, Mum. I was furious with Rick for shirking his responsibilities in terms of the house clearance. I stormed off, climbed into his car to drive to the airport, to take that flight back home. I was not driving that fast, I promise you I wasn't, but it was bucketing down with rain. I drove through the very quiet Toronto neighbourhoods. There were no cars around, no people. The road was completely clear. And then out of nowhere, this little boy just runs into the road. He was chasing after a paper that was flying up in the wind. It must have been the painting he'd done at the nursery school. I remember screaming out in the car, Mum, "No, no, please God, no." I think in that second I knew what was about to happen. I put my foot on the brakes and tried to veer out of the boy's way, but I couldn't do anything to stop it, Mum. Oh, goodness gracious, dear. I don't know what to say. That is so dreadful. Well, it happened so quickly, didn't it? I said. Everything was in fast motion, like accidents always are. The poor boy was thrown from my car on the tarmac with such a mighty crash. The blood was blooming from the back of his skull. His eyes were staring vacantly into space. And I knew, Mum, I knew in that second he was dead. Oh, goodness gracious me, sweetheart. And you didn't tell me all of this. You've been keeping all of this locked up inside of you. I can hardly believe it. Well, there's more, Mum. I do recall. The mother ran into the road. She was screaming. For a second our eyes locked together. I'll never forget the expression on her face, Mum. It was so awful, too awful to describe. I wish I could have traded places with her little boy. I'd have done that in a second, Mum. I would have done it in a second. I can't imagine what she must have gone through, losing her little boy like that. I killed him, Mum. I killed him. Oh, goodness gracious, said my mother. She scooped me lovingly into her arms, holding me tightly to her chest and patting my back, as if I was a wounded animal she wanted to comfort. You poor, poor thing, love. This is absolutely not your fault. It was a dreadful accident. The boy ran into the road. You didn't see him. You were driving responsibly. You couldn't stop in time, could you? It's like when a deer runs into the road. How many people have killed a deer that has run out into the road? More people than you can ever imagine. But they can wash that away as if it never ever happened to them. But if it had been a child, it would have been a very different story for them. And how would they have felt? They may have dashed away just like you did. In your case, it was a little boy, which of course makes it a zillion times worse. You poor, poor thing. I feel more sorry for you than the little boy, because you have to live with this. I knew something was off when you came back that night. You looked so dreadfully broken. My husband was staring at me, as if he didn't know who I was, as if in some way I was an alien species that he'd only just realized was actually his wife. He practically growled at me furiously. Why the hell didn't you get out of your car to help that poor woman, even if her boy was dead? Why would you just abandon her like that? I don't know. I was so scared. I was so frightened. I knew he was dead. It doesn't matter how scared you were. You can't just abandon your responsibilities like that. You should have helped and supported that mother, called the emergency services. Instead, you just swanned off. It's atrocious behaviour on your part. And you, of all people, with the most loving heart I know, and caring disposition, why would you do a thing like that? Do I even know the woman I married? Or is she an imposter? Adam, my mother growled at my husband. The boy was dead, for goodness sake. He was beyond help. What could my daughter do? Can you imagine how terrified she must have been? Terrified out of her wits. How would you feel if that happened to you? I'd get out of the car. I would be a responsible citizen. I would see what I could do to help the grieving woman. I would have faced up to the consequences of my actions, not run away from them like a coward. Would you, Adam? Would you really? Said my mother, rolling her eyes in exasperation. Bully for you, Adam. Bully for you. she said, clapping her hands in an exasperated sarcasm. "It's so easy for us to pass judgment on Alicia here, isn't it? To condemn her, or anyone else for that matter, for their actions, when we don't know what emotional turmoil she was going through at the time. You were not there, Adam. You don't know how you would really react in the same set of circumstances. None of us do, even if we think we would do the right thing. In that moment, Adam, no one knows what anybody would really do. Can you imagine for a second realizing that you are responsible for killing a little boy? I cannot blame my daughter for running away like she did. She must have been absolutely terrified. That's all I can say." Tears were pooling down my face. "I've got to go to the police, haven't I? Confess what's happened. I'm having nightmares about this whole thing. Sometimes I can't sleep. I do need to get this off my chest. I feel so awful for what I did. I can't possibly forgive myself for this. I wish to God I could trade places with that poor little boy. But I can't. He's dead. I really have to go to the police, to take ownership of all this, to apologize to the mother for driving off. Adam is absolutely right. I'm such a coward." "Sweetheart, how is going to the police going to make you feel any better? Believe me, it'll make you feel 1,000 times worse. It'll be like rubbing salt into the wound, and you will receive judgment from every place, believe me. People will believe the worst in you, and I'm not going to have anybody talk badly about you. Do you understand that? But I need to be accountable for what I've done. At least it'll make me feel less like a monster." "Sweetheart, listen to me. You are not a monster. This whole thing was a dreadful, dreadful accident. You will never make the mother feel better, no matter what you say or what you do, even if you take accountability for what you've done. She might want you to be locked up, to never see the light of day again. But what good would that do anybody? Remember, her little boy is never going to come back. It's too late for that. There'll be court cases, prison sentences, and you name it. You'll be dragged through the mud, my dear. And for what? People will hate you, despise you, judge you, even though if they were wearing your shoes, they may have done the very same thing, but they would never admit that to themselves. It's human nature for us to want to believe the best in ourselves. I cannot stand the hypocrisy of society that is so quick to judge and condemn another person, so quick to believe the worst in other people. We're all humans, are we not? Inclined to make mistakes. Besides, I do not believe for a second this was your fault. I know what a responsible driver you are. I keep reiterating, it was a tragic accident, and you were driving in the rain. The conditions weren't great. I blame the mother for letting her little son run into the road like that. Why didn't she stop him? It's terrible that this happened. But if the boy hadn't run into the road chasing his painting, that mother would still have her son with her. She should also take accountability for what happened, don't you think? Mum, I'm a monster for driving off the way I did. Don't you get it? How could I have the audacity to call myself a human being? I need to call the police. Even if I'm locked away for years and years, it's no more than I deserve. As far as I'm concerned, they can lock me up and throw me into a padded cell. I'm a bad person, Mum. You're not calling the police, said my husband, his face softening. Your mother is absolutely right. What she says makes perfect sense to me. Do you know, you're one of the most responsible drivers I know. You've never even had a parking ticket in your life. None of us know how we would react in the same set of circumstances. Fear can make us act out of character. It is devastating the little boy had to lose his life like this. But your mother's right. We can't bring him back. His life may have been ruined. He's lost his life. His mother's life is never going to be the same. But why should your life be ruined as well? If you went to prison, we would also have our lives ruined. Me and your mother, we would have lost you. And that's enough for anybody to lose. We can't lose you. I'm not going to let that happen. I'm never going to let that happen. Do you understand? It's kind of you to say all this, Adam, but I still believe I should go to the police. You can't go to the police. I love you. So does your mother. Very, very much. If you're locked away, what good will that do? We will also be cruelly punished. One child has died. Now we have to suffer too for this tragic accident? I think not. How much damage is there to the car? Did anybody see you? The newspaper says there are no witnesses. No one saw me. But I would remember the mother if I saw her again. I know I would. I could easily pick her up from a lineup. I'm not kidding either. It's as if she's indelibly drawn on my mind forever, like a tattoo you can't wash away. Her face still haunts me. Oh, sweetheart, I'm so dreadfully sorry for what you've been through. I knew something was up with you. You've lost your sparkle and ebullience. You seem to always have this far-away, rather tragic look in your eyes. I knew you were grievously distressed about something. We can get through this, love. I know we can. And if you have to have counselling, we'll go through that path as well. We'll do anything we can to help you. I'm not sure I can forgive myself for this, Mum. I did something so dreadful. How can I live with myself? You're not going to the police, said my husband. You want to ruin our lives as well, do you? I'm not going anywhere. I'm too much of a coward to take ownership of this. It's easier to pretend it never happened. Otherwise, it's too hard to live with myself. Then that's what we're going to do, said my mother resolutely. We're going to pretend that none of this happened and move on with our lives. Put this whole thing behind us. 2 months later. You're not going to believe it, said my mother. There's a lovely lady, I believe, that's moved into Barry's cabin next door. Angie Barry got in contact with me the other day to let me know that somebody would be making use of the cabin's facilities for a while. The place has been empty for such a long time. Apparently the lady that's moved into the cabin, her name is Ella McIntosh. She's from Toronto. She's a very nice lady. I popped over there myself to see her and invited her over for dinner tonight. I hope you don't mind, but she is our new neighbour. It seemed like the right thing to do. Apparently she's here for an extended break. I gather from Angie that she's a little emotionally fragile, had some family trauma of some kind. Hearing the name Ella McIntosh made my face drain of all its colour. Was this some kind of warped joke? Wasn't Ella McIntosh the name of the mother whose little boy I'd run over in the road in Toronto? Was I now being punished for my sins? Was this Karma's way of getting back at me, making me accountable? The police had closed the investigation into the hit-and-run accident, which had brought my husband and mother much relief. So Ella McIntosh had moved into the cabin next door to us. She must be the same lady whose son I had mown down. It didn't bear thinking about. I was almost 100% certain of this preposterous fact. What were the slim chances of this woman actually moving next door to us? It was like the odds of winning the lottery, but stranger things have happened. McIntosh, I knew, was not a common name. This woman was from Toronto. I knew it had to be the same woman. But my mother seemed oblivious to this fact. I was reluctant to put her into the picture. I knew I would recognize Ella McIntosh the moment I saw her. But the burning question that seared through my mind, like a smouldering red-hot coal, was would she remember me? I didn't actually care if she did. I needed to get this tragedy off my chest. I had thought so often of going off to Toronto to find Ella McIntosh for myself, so that I could apologize to her for what I'd done. I knew the woman would likely kill me, or frog-march me herself to the police station, so that I could be arrested and charged. It was no more than I deserved. I think I was almost tempting fate for this to happen. What on earth is wrong with you, Alicia? Your face is paled. You've gone awfully white. You're not upset, are you, that I invited a strange lady to dinner? It seemed like the right thing to do with her being alone and all that. We're her nearest neighbours, and her being from Toronto, she likely doesn't know many people around these parts. No, I think it's great you invited her over. It was the right thing to do, I said, deciding firmly not to tell my mother who I believed Ella was. It would freak her out, I knew that for sure. I wondered if Ella would tell perfect strangers about what had happened to her son. That was personal stuff that she was privately dealing with on her own, and I was certain she wasn't the type that would air her dirty laundry. And if she did, well then my husband and mother would almost certainly cotton on to who she was. Ella McIntosh was exactly as I remembered her to be when I opened the front door, only she was a lot thinner and much more emaciated than I remembered. I recognized her face at once, and yet in her eyes I perceived she had no memory of me, which was a relief. I saw no hint of recognition on her face. "This is so kind of you to invite me over for dinner," she said, smiling warmly at us. "My name is Ella McIntosh." "Well, I'm so delighted, Ella, that you could come, and that you were able to accept our invitation. You're our new neighbour, after all, and around here folk are very friendly, you know. It's very natural for us to invite our next-door neighbours over for dinner. Angie Barry told me you were moving in for a while, to her cabin next door to us." "That's right. I moved in about 2 days ago. It's so lovely." "It's beautiful. The cabin's been empty for such a long time, and it's such a pretty place. So I'm very glad it's finally occupied. I was actually going to suggest to the Barrys that they let the place out. It seems a dreadful shame not to get a rental income for a highly desirable sought-after cabin like that, in this kind of part of the world where it's just so idyllic." "Well, that's right. I don't know why they haven't rented the place out. It seems a crazy thing not to do. I mean, when I moved in, I just was so overwhelmed by how spectacular and well-organised the place is." My mother's voice dropped to a lower tone. "Angie Barry did happen to mention that you were going through some personal stuff, Ella, and needed a break from the rat race of Toronto. Is that right?" Ella flinched. She gave my mother a watery smile. I could see the pain in her eyes, and I felt so dreadful for her, because I knew I was responsible for causing her all this grievous hurt. "Something like that," she said gingerly, "but I hope you don't mind if I don't talk about it." "No, of course you don't have to talk about it. This is the best place in the world to come and relax, you know. People come to these parts from all over the world. They never get over the idyllic scenery, the turquoise lakes, the sculptural mountains, the beautiful town of Banff that is so breathtaking. There isn't anything not to like about living here. I pinch myself every day, you know. I consider myself to be incredibly blessed." "You are very blessed to live here," said Ella in agreement. "I went to the town of Banff today to buy a few essentials. I was blown away by how beautiful it was. I felt like I was in Switzerland, on the cover of a chocolate box. And I'm not joking either. It's spectacularly beautiful. I'm so glad the Barrys told me to come here. The mountain air is already making me feel so much better." "Oh, I am so delighted to hear that. Not that I'm remotely surprised. The mountain air is remarkable. It can make you feel alive. That's what I always say. So you're telling me that the Barrys are your immediate next-door neighbours in Toronto? Is that right?" "Well, they don't exactly live next door to me, but near enough, on our street. They are the absolute best," said Ella. "Genuinely nice people. The salt of the earth, if you know what I mean. I never fully appreciated them before. I mean, Angie's husband, well, he can talk the tail off a donkey, but he's got the kindest heart. And as for Angie, well, she's amazing." "Oh, they are the most wonderful couple. Very, very charming people. How are you finding the cabin, love? asked my mother. "You do know that if you need anything, you only have to ask us. We're right next door and would love to help in any way we can. You need only say the word." "That's terribly kind of you, but I think the Barrys' cabin is so well kitted out. It's got absolutely everything in it, if you know what I mean." "Oh, Angie Barry is so organized. That woman just is incredible. She is the most efficient woman I've ever met, so I'm not surprised that the cabin is well kitted out. But I'm very glad to hear that. I hope you don't mind me being very nosy, but I'm not exactly known for not being. I'm a very inquisitive person. Do you mind telling me, Ella, how long you intend to stay here?" "As long as I need. I'm not really sure at the moment. I've just been going through some personal stuff, you know." "Of course, dear. That's perfectly understandable. We all go through, peaks and troughs in our lives. That's what I say. I went through some issues myself with my ex-husband. When I left him years ago, he's now my late husband, actually. It was a tough time for me, you know. It's not a man, love, giving you all this grief. Because if it is, just remember that he's not worth it." "No, nothing like that," said Ella, twiddling her fork nervously. "I never married, so no, it's definitely not a man. This is delicious, Mrs. "Please don't call me Mrs.," said my mother. "I'm Flo." "This is delicious, Flo. It's one of the best chicken and ham pies I've ever tasted." "I'm so glad you like it, Ella. It is so nice to have such an appreciative guest. You must come over to dinner more often." "I'd like that very much." I noticed over the evening meal that Ella made a very poor showing of her food, even though she claimed to enjoy it. It wasn't surprising that a mother who'd lost her son 2 months prior was struggling to work up much of an appetite. Indeed, since the event, I had lost over 30 pounds effortlessly, without even bothering to try. Everyone in town was asking me what my secret was. "Are you on the paleo or carnivore diet? It's the latest craze," I was told. "People are losing weight on it." "No," I told them. "Are you kidding? Isn't that a diet where you're restricted to eating meat only? No wonder people lose weight on that, because there's so little calories on it. I would never eat a diet that restricted carbs. I suspect that the secret to success is all that calorie reduction, because I've been eating less and I've lost the weight. That's my secret. I could afford to lose weight, but if Ella McIntosh got any thinner, she could just fade away." Once the dinner was over, Ella said her goodbyes to us. She was very appreciative about everything. "Thank you so very much, Flo. Thank you, all of you, for the lovely, lovely meal I had tonight. It was really good to be in company for a change. I enjoyed myself so much, and the food was excellent." "Well, I'm so delighted you enjoyed yourself, Ella. It was a privilege having you over. You are so appreciative about my food, and that I'm very grateful for. You must come around more often. You're right next door to us, so you can pop over whenever you like." "I'll do that. Thank you very much." I watched Ella get into her car that she had hired for her trip to Alberta. She drove back to her cabin, which was quite literally a walk away through the woods. I lay in my bed that night very restlessly, tossing and turning. My husband was incessantly complaining that I was moving around so much. "What the hell is wrong with you, love? You're so restless tonight. Have you got ants in your pants or something? You're rocking the whole bed, and it's very annoying." "What did you think of Ella McIntosh?" I asked, sitting up in my bed and staring into space. "I thought she was a very sweet lady. Very nice lady. I will say, though, that she did seem rather sad. What's all this about? Why are you asking me about this woman?" "Nothing," I said, trying to get back to sleep, but sleep eluded me, as a festering guilt overwhelmed me, until I could bear it no longer. It had reached the point of no return. I was going to face my demons whether I liked it or not. I was going to see Ella right now, admit to her what I'd done, and frankly it would be a relief to be thrown into jail. At least then I might actually get a good night's sleep for once in my life, even if I had to live on prison slop for the rest of my years, and live among women who had murdered their husbands or committed fraud. It was the price I would have to pay, but I'd have to live with it. I could hear my husband's snores, and felt satisfied he was fast asleep. So I cautiously, rather clandestinely, climbed out of bed. I scrambled over to the wardrobe rather awkwardly, hurriedly putting on a tracksuit and a pair of trainers. If my husband or my mother had a clue of what I was up to now, they would stop me, so I was glad I had not told them who Ella Mackintosh really was. Before I knew it, with a torch in my hands, I was taking a quick shortcut through the woods to get to Ella's cabin. I knew I needed to strike while the iron was hot, or I might retract on what I was intending to do. I had never been comfortable about ambitiously taking walks in the dark, especially through the woodgrove. But when you don't really care what happens to you, it's amazing how your fear just abandons you. My resolute determination seemed more powerful than the torchlight that I was using to help me make my way through the trees. It was incredibly dark, so much so that I could barely see my hand before my face. I was trembling rather nervously as I meandered down the footpath, losing my footing from time to time when I tripped over burgeoning roots and creepers that trespassed across the earthen floor. I was cursing under my breath, annoyed that I kept tripping over and falling, but I was determined to go on with this mission. I was driven by an inward power beyond my comprehension, and that was when I heard the strange whistling. I stopped short in my track. I wondered who would be whistling in the woods at this time of night. It seemed oddly bizarre. I had heard whistles before during the day, of course I had, but I put those down to bird calls. But at night, the whistling seemed very out of place. Moments later, I heard swift movements, ponderous feet shuffling towards me, and then I saw the Bigfoot again, the one that I'd encountered on my return journey home that night in the car, the one that had blocked the driveway and welcomed me back home. What were the chances of running into the elusive creature again like this? You would have thought I would have felt vulnerable and afraid, being in the presence of such a mighty, powerful creature, but I didn't even flinch, as his presence was so benevolent. The Bigfoot stopped whistling almost at once. His bright yellow eyes bored into mine, and then the Bigfoot spoke to me in a curious language. I didn't understand what he was saying, but his words miraculously translated themselves into English. Ha minalakwa, ho tilasinato, ikani salabani, ho shaki salinoa, imani saki tonafo. It is good to see you again, but you need to abandon this dark energy that consumes you, or it will eat you alive. You are like the lady staying in the cabin. You need to let it go. Both of you do. It is bad for your health. It needs to be disposed of. I didn't say anything, but stared at the Bigfoot incredulously. How could he know this about me? How could he know that I had such dark energy, that I was carrying it around with me wherever I went, and that he could read Ella Mackintosh's energy as well? Akitalakwana, ha pita. Do you want to go to see the lady in the cabin? I nodded. Yes, I do. That's where I'm going now. Well, I will take you there. Hilatinaka, himotolasha. Follow me, because you will get lost if you don't. The Bigfoot led me through the woodgrove, and then he just turned around and glided away and was gone from my sight. When I reached the cabin door, I knocked on it very gently, but the door flew wide open. Ella Mackintosh was standing there in the doorway. I knew you were coming. Isn't that funny? I just had a feeling about it. You knew? I asked, looking confounded. Do you even know who I am, Ella? Yes, I do. I recognized your face when I was eating the ham and chicken pie. It just suddenly came to me who you were. Do you remember my face?" She nodded. Tears spilled down her cheeks. "You must hate me, absolutely hate me. If I were you, I would hate me. Driving off like I did. I don't know what to say. I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry, Ella." The next thing that happened was we ran into each other's arms and began to sob. We cried for what seemed like an age, and then Ella invited me into the cabin and prepared a hot chocolate for me. "He was such a special boy, Harry," she said. "I miss him every single day. But I'm relieved he died the way he did. It would have been 1,000 times worse if he'd suffered in any way, if you know what I mean. But I'm not angry with you for what happened. It was a tragic accident." "You're not angry?" I asked, looking at her aghast. "Don't you want to call the police on me? Have me arrested? It's no more than I deserve. That's what you should do, you know." She shook her head vigorously. "Absolutely not. What good would that do? Why would locking you up in prison make me feel any better? It would make me feel 1,000 times worse, let me tell you. It's not going to bring Harry back. And besides, it really was an accident. And you weren't driving fast. You were driving responsibly. Harry was holding my hand. He then let go of it and then just ran into the road like a bat out of hell. I tried to stop him, but I couldn't. And I could see you tried to stop your car, but you couldn't avoid him, even though you tried. But I'm equally as responsible for what happened. And frankly, I don't blame you for driving off in the way you did. You were terrified. I could see it in your eyes. You were as frightened as I was. We were both in a terribly shocked place. There was no doubt about that in my mind." "I don't understand how you could even bear to look at me, Ella. I thought once I told you who I was, you'd want to skin me alive." At that, Ella laughed. "Don't be so hard on yourself. We've both been punished enough, don't you think? I think we're both in grievous pain. I believe we can help each other out through the bumps in the road. I can see you're hurting as much as I am. We can get through this together, don't you think? Don't worry about the police. They've closed the investigation. I already told them that even if they did find the driver, I would never want to press charges because the whole thing was just an accident. I know you couldn't stop in time. And yes, you drove off. But as I keep saying to you, I understand why you did what you did. In your shoes, I'd have probably done exactly the same. How can I blame you for that?" I'm very glad to tell you that Ella is alive and well and very healthy these days, as am I. She lived in the cabin next door to us for 5 years and got married very recently. They now have a 3-year-old boy, and we still remain the best of friends. Ella's son looks like the splitting image of Harry, so she feels almost as if she's got him back. I'm glad I didn't have to go to prison, which is what I deserve, but Ella was so incredibly forgiving towards me, and we have cemented a long enduring friendship. My brother never did ask me about the crack on the windscreen. He never even got it fixed, but thank God his wife Susie helped him finish up the cleaning project on my father's house. Otherwise it would never have even got to the market. I insisted on giving my share of my father's inheritance to Ella as compensation for what I'd done to her, and at first she refused to accept it, but I persuaded her that it eased my conscience a little. So she did receive it. I have not seen the Bigfoot again, but Ella saw him once. She claimed he nodded at her and glided away. So there you are. That's my story. Wow, what an incredible story. And what an incredible story of forgiveness and compassion. Because so often when you've done something really bad, you expect that person to come down on you like a ton of bricks, and especially if something that is so devastating concerning your own family. And I'm blown away by the compassion that was shown to this young woman.
Well, hello there. I hope you enjoyed the Omnibus edition. We've got many more coming our way for you to listen to. Sending you love wherever you are in the world, in North America, Canada, Kenya, wherever you may be. I send you lots and lots of love. Thank you for listening to my omnibus, and I really do hope you enjoyed it, because that's the whole idea about it, is to give you some interesting stories to listen to. So until next time, goodbye and good night.